Hey there, tonight we're diving into the bustling world of a medieval town at Christmas, where the truth is, carolers weren't just singing about joy, but also dodging chamber parts from above. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. In the heart of a medieval town, where the streets are as narrow as the patience of a merchant shortchanged, the Yuletide frenzy is palpable. Picture this. The year is 1373, and the townsfolk are gearing up for Christmas with the kind of enthusiasm that might make modern-day holiday shoppers seem downright apathetic. The marketplace is a whirlwind of sights, smells, and sounds, a medieval version of Black Friday, minus the questionable electronics. As the cold wind bites through layers of woolen cloaks, vendors hawk their wares with the fervor of auctioneers at a cattle sale. In this bustling hub, everything from spices to fabrics is up for grabs, though it'll cost you a pretty penny, or rather, a silver penny, the coin of the realm. Speaking of costs, let's talk numbers. A sack of flour might set you back about 3 pence, while a pound of saffron, the real star of the spice rack, could fetch around 15 shillings, and you thought organic avocados were pricey. Getting these goods to market is no small feat, either. Picture carts trundling along muddy roads, drivers cursing under their breath as they navigate potholes deep enough to swallow a sheep. Logistics in the 14th century might not have involved GPS, but they certainly demanded a sharp mind and sharper elbows. After all, securing prime market space was akin to snagging a front row seat at a Taylor Swift concert. Now, let's talk guilds. These were the medieval answer to trade unions, and they didn't just influence the market, they ruled it. Bakers, butchers, candlestick makers all had their guilds, each with strict codes and regulations. They dictated everything from the quality of goods to the price, and woe betide any craftsman who dared to deviate. Imagine getting fined for a pie that's more crust than filling. Medieval consumers were fierce about their pastry rights. Guilds ensured that every loaf of bread was up to snuff, or someone's kneecaps might meet the wrong end of a mace. Interestingly, these guilds weren't just about enforcing standards. They also held the keys to economic stability. By setting prices and controlling supply, they could mitigate the kind of market fluctuations that could lead to famine. It's a delicate balance, like juggling knives while blindfolded, but it kept the town's economy ticking over. Regulations were the backbone of the marketplace, and they went beyond just guild rules. Town charters often included quirky laws that would make today's health and safety inspectors blush. For example, there were fines for selling ale that wasn't up to scratch, and heaven help the brewer whose beer was as flat as their singing voice at midnight mass. The rules were strict, but they ensured that quality remained high and that the festive season didn't end in a mass case of food poisoning. Of course, amid this whirl of commerce and regulation, the townsfolk themselves were a colorful mix. From the wealthy merchant counting his coins to the peasant with just enough for a candle and a hunk of bread, everyone played their part in this economic dance. The marketplace was a microcosm of society, a place where fortunes could be made and dreams dashed over the price of a pig. Despite this hustle and bustle, or perhaps because of it, the sense of community was strong. This was a world where everyone knew everyone else's business, where rivalries simmered beneath the surface and alliances were as changeable as the weather. Yet, when the church bells tolled, calling all to the Christmas Mass, these differences were set aside, at least temporarily, as the town came together to celebrate. In this medieval melee of commerce and camaraderie, it's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine the marketplace as a quaint gathering of honest tradesmen. But let's not forget the grit beneath the glitter. The reality was often as harsh as the winter chill, with poverty and disease lurking in the shadows. Yet the resilience of these medieval townsfolk is something to marvel at. They found joy in simplicity, community in the chaos, and perhaps, most importantly, knew how to throw a Christmas celebration that would make even the most jaded modern reveler envious. So as you drift off, dreaming of medieval feasts and festive cheer, spare a thought for the bustling marketplace. where the clang of coins and the cries of vendors created a symphony of seasonal spirit. This was Christmas, medieval style, a time when the world slowed down, if only for a moment, to celebrate the simple joys of life. As the clamor of the marketplace fades, let's wander beyond the stalls, into the very heart of medieval society's Christmas cheer, or, as it often was, a curious mix of cheer and chill. Now, before we get too swept up in the idea of a medieval town as a jolly holiday utopia, let's pause for a reality check. Yes, there were feasts and festivities, but it wasn't exactly a Hallmark movie, folks. First, we need to talk about class distinctions, because medieval society was essentially a tiered cake with layers as defined as the lines between light and dark in a Gothic cathedral. At the top, lording over their domains, were the nobility. And believe me, their Christmas celebrations were the stuff of legend, or at least of envy. Picture grand halls decked with tapestries and roaring fireplaces, where the only thing bigger than the feasts was the ego of the host. The nobility indulged in meals that could rival those of a modern Michelin-starred restaurant, serving up delicacies like roasted swan and spiced wine. Not exactly your average turkey dinner. The numbers are staggering. A typical noble Christmas feast might feature up to 24 dishes, including meats, pies, and the occasional peacock pie, feathers and all. Yes, peacock was on the menu, because why not eat something as ostentatious as your lifestyle? It's said that Richard Roman II, the English king renowned for his extravagant tastes, once hosted a banquet with 28 oxen and 300 sheep. That's a lot of mutton, and probably a few disgruntled shepherds. Yet this wasn't just about gluttony. It was a display of wealth and power. Hosting such a feast was a political statement, a way to solidify alliances and demonstrate dominance. The richer the table, the more secure the seat of power. And let's not forget the entertainment. Jesters, minstrels, and even the odd acrobat were hired to keep the guests amused. It's like a medieval version of dinner and a show, but with a lot more juggling and slightly less Netflix. Meanwhile, the common folk were reveling in their own way. Sure, they didn't have swan or peacock on their tables, but they had something perhaps more valuable, community. Their celebrations were less about opulence and more about togetherness. Village Green would come alive with music and dancing, a scene that, while lacking in silk and satin, was rich in spirit. For the commoners, Christmas was a time to break the routine of daily drudgery. You see, life was hard, no surprise there. Most of the year was spent toiling in fields, battling both the elements and the occasional outbreak of plague. But come Christmas, the break in labor was as welcome as a sunny day in a medieval English winter, allowing them to gather, feast, and, importantly, drink. Ale flowed freely, and while it might not have been the finest vintage, it was enough to warm both body and soul. The communal feast was a patchwork of what was available. If the nobility dined on extravagance, the commoners made do with hearty fare, stews, bread, and perhaps a bit of bacon or cheese if they were lucky. It's the medieval equivalent of potluck, where everyone contributes what they can. And let's not forget the religious undertone. Christmas was, after all, a holy day. The church played a central role, with services that united the community in shared belief, if not shared wealth. Religion, in fact, was the glue that held this festive tapestry together. The church bells didn't just call people to prayer, they called them to community. Midnight Mass was a highlight, a time when even the walls of social hierarchy seemed to blur in the candlelit glow. Yet, despite this spiritual unity, the myth of a universally merry medieval Christmas is just that, a myth. For many, it was a brief respite from a life of hardship, a time to enjoy simple pleasures before returning to the relentless grind of survival. In truth, the medieval Christmas was a season of contrasts, as stark as the winter landscape itself. From the lavish halls of the nobility to the humble homes of the commoners, the celebrations were as diverse as the people who partook in them. It was a time when the social order was both challenged and reinforced, a paradox wrapped in holly and ivy. So, as we ponder the past, let's appreciate both the romance and the reality of medieval Christmas. It wasn't all merriment and mince pies, but it was a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of people finding joy in their own ways. And perhaps, in the end, that's the true spirit of the season, then and now. While the echoes of merrymaking drift like smoke on a winter breeze, let's dive into the not-so-jolly underbelly of medieval Christmas. Time to explore the murky waters where politics, religion, and festive cheer swirled together in a medieval punch bowl with less sugar and more vinegar. First up, the church. Ah yes, the medieval church, a towering institution with influence as pervasive as the smell of mulled wine at a Christmas market. Its power wasn't just spiritual, it was political, economic, and at times, downright theatrical. You see, Christmas wasn't merely a time for piety and prayer. It was a stage where the church displayed its might, kind of like the original influencer flexing its divine clout. Take the Crusades, those epic holy wars that were as much about land and loot as they were about liberating Jerusalem. These campaigns weren't just distant battles. They had a direct impact on how Christmas was celebrated back home. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land brought back spices and stories, exotic tales that spiced up both the Christmas table and the imagination. But these were also times of tension, as the church leveraged the Crusades to tighten its grip on the faithful. Indulgences were granted, sins forgiven, all for a tidy sum, of course. It was a cosmic transaction that made the church richer and the common folk poorer, wrapped in the guise of salvation. And let's not forget the local lords, those medieval magnates who were as likely to decree as they were to dine. Christmas was a time for them to reinforce their authority, to remind their vassals who held the purse strings and the power. Lords would host grand feasts not just for the joy of it, but as a political maneuver. Inviting neighboring nobles was a strategic move, a chance to forge alliances or, perhaps, size up the competition. It was a high-stakes game, where the loss of face could cost you more than a poorly baked mince pie. Speaking of power plays, the church had its own ways to keep the lords in check. Ever heard of the Feast of Fools? This was a medieval festival that turned the social order on its head, where the lowest of the low could mark the highest of the high, in theory at least. But don't get too excited. This topsy-turvy day was allowed only under the watchful eye of the church, and any misstep could end with a swift trip to the stocks. It was a pressure valve, a societal safety net, serving the dual purpose of letting people vent while keeping them firmly under ecclesiastical thumb. Now, here's the kicker. Despite all this political maneuvering, Christmas was still heralded as a season of peace and goodwill. The myth of universal harmony, however, is about as solid as a meringue in a monsoon. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, like a pot of porridge on a medieval hearth. The church preached charity and compassion, yet the gap between rich and poor was as wide as the moat around a lord's castle. In towns, the Christmas spirit often did little to bridge this chasm, as the wealthy feasted while the poor scraped by, hoping to catch a crumb or two from the Lord's table. And then there were the decrees. Oh, the decrees. Imagine Christmas customs dictated by edicts that would make even the most bureaucratic of today's governments blush. Some were practical, like those regulating the price of bread or the sale of ale, not all that different from modern-day consumer protection laws, albeit with more dire consequences for non-compliance. Others, however, were bizarre. Take the law forbidding bakers from selling mince pies too cheaply. Why? Because it was thought that cheap pies were the devil's work, enticing the poor away from their moral duties. You can't make this stuff up, or rather, you don't have to, because history already did. So, as much as we might picture medieval Christmas as a scene from a holiday card, remember that it was a season fraught with power struggles and social tensions. Lords and clergy wielded Christmas like a cudgel, a time to exhibit dominance and reinforce hierarchies, all while preaching a message of peace. It's the kind of contradiction that makes history so deliciously complex and human nature so delightfully predictable. Yet, in this dance of power and piety, there was still room for genuine celebration. For all the scheming and sermonizing, people found ways to carve out moments of joy, and that's the paradox of medieval Christmas. A time when the weight of the world was momentarily lifted, despite the heavy chains of power and politics. So, as we continue our journey through the alleys and avenues of medieval festivities, keep an eye out for the shadows lurking beneath the tinsel and holly. The history of Christmas is not just a tale of merriment and mirth. It's a story of resilience and rebellion, of finding light in the darkness. It's about real people navigating a world that was, in many ways, as complex and contradictory as our own. Stay tuned, because the tapestry of Christmas past is far from finished. Now, as we wade deeper into the medieval Christmas quagmire, we find ourselves standing on the muddy streets of reality, a far cry from the snow globe fantasy. Let's not mince words. Life for the average medieval Joe was as rough as a boar's hide and about as forgiving. The lower classes, those resilient souls, faced a season of survival rather than celebration, with winter casting a long, cold shadow over their already precarious existence. Consider this. The average medieval peasant worked the land as if their life depended on it, because it did. Agriculture was a back-breaking business, a relentless cycle of sowing, reaping, and occasionally weeping when the harvest failed. And come winter, the fields lay as barren as a king's conscience. Food stores dwindled, and the spectre of famine loomed ever larger. For many, Christmas was less about feasting and more about hoping the last sack of grain would stretch until spring. Speaking of grain, here's a number to chew on. In the 14th century, a peasant family might consume around 2 pounds of bread per person per day. That's a lot of dough, my friends, and not the kind that jingles in your pocket. Bread was the lifeblood of medieval diets, the cornerstone of sustenance, and when the harvest was poor, the bread got poorer too, often stretched with sawdust or whatever else was at hand to make it last. Imagine a Christmas loaf that could double as a doorstop cherry, right? Yet, despite these dire conditions, the myth of a picturesque, snow-dusted medieval town persists, with jolly carolers and twinkling lights. Let's set the record straight. Winter in medieval Europe was less a wonderland and more a treacherous test of endurance. Snow was not a fluffy backdrop for festive frolics, but an obstacle, turning roads into icy death traps and isolating villages like some medieval version of a lockdown. And the cold, bone-chilling doesn't quite capture it. Most homes resembled drafty barns more than cozy cottages, with thatched roofs and wattle and daub walls offering scant protection against the elements. Heating was a luxury. The hearth provided warmth only if there was wood to burn, which was about as plentiful as hen's teeth in some regions. It's no surprise that winters were often spent huddled together for warmth, a communal survival tactic that brought new meaning to the term close-knit community. Now, let's talk about health, or the medieval version of it anyway. Winters were a breeding ground for illness, with no shortage of ailments ready to pounce like a cat on a mouse. The common cold was more a common catastrophe, and respiratory infections ran rampant in the damp, drafty living conditions. And forget about modern remedies. The medieval medicine cabinet was a curious mix of herbs, hope, and a dash of divine intervention. A poultice here, a prayer there. Healthcare was as much about faith as it was about fever. In this context, it's not hard to see why the notion of an idyllic medieval Christmas is more myth than reality. The festive season was a brief respite from relentless hardship, a time when even the smallest joys were seized with both hands. For the lower classes, Christmas was less about material wealth and more about the wealth of the spirit, a chance to celebrate survival itself. Despite the struggles, there was a certain resilience to these medieval communities, a gritty determination to find light in the darkest of winters. The church played no small part in this, offering not just spiritual solace, but a social safety net of sorts. The traditions and rituals of Christmas, from the singing of carols to the sharing of a communal meal, were a balm for weary souls, a reminder that they were not alone in their struggles. And speaking of carols, let's peel back the layers of those harmonious myths. Sure, there were songs, but they were less about decking the halls and more about telling tales, often bawdy, sometimes poignant, always a reflection of the world they lived in. Forget Silent Night. Medieval carols were the original folk music, a tapestry of voices weaving stories of life, love, and the occasional scandal. For the lower classes, these songs were a form of resistance, a way to reclaim their narrative in a world that often silenced them. The carolers weren't just spreading cheer, they were preserving culture, passing down oral histories in a time when few could read or write. It was a powerful reminder that even in the harshest of times, the human spirit finds ways to sing. So, as we peel back the romantic veneer of medieval Christmas, we find a story of survival and solidarity. The lower classes, with their meager means and indomitable will, remind us that Christmas has always been about more than gifts and glitz. It's about community, courage, and the relentless pursuit of hope in the face of adversity. As we edge closer to the conclusion of this medieval tale, let's keep our eyes peeled for the next twist in the Yuletide saga. There's more to uncover, more myths to bust, and more truths to reveal about a time that, for all its hardship, still found room for celebration. Stay tuned, because the story of Christmas past has more chapters yet to unfold. And so, as we pull aside the heavy curtain of myth, revealing a medieval Christmas less like a snow-dusted fairy tale and more like a season of survival, let's take a moment to reflect on why these romanticized narratives endure. Why do we still find ourselves dreaming of cozy cottages, feasting halls, and merry carolers, when the reality was much more about drafty hovels, political power plays, and the relentless chill of winter? Let's face it, folks, nostalgia is a powerful drug. It's like the mulled wine of emotions, warming us up while glossing over the bitter reality. The myth of the idyllic medieval Christmas persists because it taps into a universal longing for simpler times, even if those times were anything but simple. The idea of a communal celebration, where differences are set aside and everyone gathers around the hearth, is a comforting one, even if it's more fiction than fact. Take the notion of the grand feast. The medieval banquet, the stuff of legends, or at least of Instagram fantasies, if it had existed back then. Sure, some noble's dining table might have groaned under the weight of peacock pies and roasted swan, but for the average peasant, it was more likely a humble stew and a prayer it wouldn't run out. Yet, the image of abundance sticks because it represents hope, a hope that even in the darkest times, there might be a moment of plenty. And what about the carolers, those merry bands of singers braving the winter chill to spread cheer? In reality, singing was often more about survival than serenading. It was a way to earn a few coins or a heart meal, a practical pursuit wrapped in the guise of holiday spirit. Yet, the legend of joyous carolers endures because it speaks to our desire for community, for a shared experience that transcends the daily grind. If we peer closer, we find that these myths offer something else, a mirror to our own times. Just as medieval Christmas was a mix of hardship and hope, so too is our modern holiday season, a blend of stress and celebration. The frantic rush for gifts, the pressure to host the perfect party, the expectations of family gatherings, they echo the medieval struggle to make Christmas special, despite the odds. And let's not forget the economic angle. The medieval marketplace, with its guilds and regulations, was its own kind of Black Friday, a frenzy of buying and selling that fueled the local economy. Today, the holiday season is big business, with billions spent on everything from gifts to decorations. The numbers are staggering. In the U.S. alone, holiday retail sales in 2022 topped $936 billion. It's as if the medieval marketplace has been reborn, just with more electronic gadgets and fewer swans. Yet, for all the commercialism, there's still a thread of the old world in our modern celebrations. The idea of giving, of sharing what we have with others, is a legacy that stretches back to those medieval towns, where even the poorest found a way to contribute to the communal feast. The spirit of charity, of reaching out to those less fortunate, is something that transcends time, a reminder that even in the hustle and bustle, there's room for kindness. And let's not overlook the role of religion. In medieval times, the church was a dominant force, dictating not just spiritual life, but social order. Today, while the religious aspect of Christmas is less pronounced for some, it remains a time of reflection for many, a chance to pause and consider the deeper meaning of the season. It's a thread that connects us to the past, even as our celebrations evolve. As we wrap up our journey through the cobblestone streets of medieval Christmas, it's clear that the myths and the reality are two sides of the same coin. The legends endure because they offer a glimpse of what we wish for, a world where community triumphs over division, where joy is found in the simplest of things, where hope springs eternal even in the darkest of winters. So next time you find yourself caught in the holiday rush, spare a thought for those medieval revelers who, despite their hardships, found a way to celebrate. Remember the resilience of those who face the cold, not just of winter, but of life's challenges, and still manage to find warmth in each other's company. In the end, perhaps the true gift of medieval Christmas is its reminder that the spirit of the season isn't found in opulence or perfection, but in the simple act of coming together. Whether it's around a roaring fire or a flickering screen, the essence of Christmas remains the same, a celebration of life, love, and the enduring human spirit. So there you have it, a medieval Christmas tale that's as much about reality as romance, a journey through a time both foreign and familiar. As we step back into our own world, let's carry with us the lessons of the past, the knowledge that even in the toughest of times, there's always room for joy. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of that medieval magic will find its way into our modern celebrations, reminding us that while the details may change, the heart of Christmas beats on. The first frost of the season nibbles at your nose, reminding you that winter's icy grip is just around the corner. You've spent the last few months racing against time, trying to coax every last bit of life from the soil before it turns as unyielding as the local baron's heart. The medieval countryside is no postcard of rolling fields and quaint cottages. It's a battleground where survival demands strategy, grit, and a bit of luck. Let's talk about that relentless schedule you've been keeping. The sun barely peeks over the horizon before you're out in the fields, wielding a plough that's seen better days. It might feel like you're just going through the motions, but each furrow is a lifeline for the long slog ahead. You see, the medieval growing season is shorter than a peasant's lunch break. You've got from late March until early October to grow, harvest, and squirrel away enough food to last until the spring thaw. That's roughly 190 days to fend off starvation, a medieval version of beating the clock. Now, about those romantic notions of simple peasant life, let's toss them into the midden heap where they belong. You're not just a farmer, you're a one-person economy. You harvest, you preserve, you trade, and then you do it all over again, like a never-ending loop of toil and sweat. Forget the Instagrammable image of a peasant whistling while they work. Surviving winter means breaking your back during harvest time, when the days are long and the sun is relentless, all while keeping an eye on the sky, because one ill-timed storm can ruin everything. Once the crops are in, the real fun begins, food preservation. It's a delicate art and a brutal science. Salt is your best friend and worst enemy, a necessary evil that can make or break your winter provisions. In 14th century England, a pound of salt cost roughly 6 pence, equivalent to about a day's wages for a skilled labourer. With prices like that, it's no wonder you guard your stash like a dragon guards its hoard. You need it to cure meats and keep your pickled vegetables from turning into a science experiment gone wrong. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom. There's a certain camaraderie among your fellow peasants as you gather in the village, swapping stories, and maybe a little gossip, while you barter for whatever you can't produce yourself. The local barter system is your lifeline. You trade some of your prized cabbages for a few eggs or a bit of wool to patch up your threadbare tunic. It's a delicate dance, this barter business. You've got to know the value of what you've got and what you need. A misstep could mean a long, hungry winter. Of course, there's always the tax collector lurking like a shadow on your doorstep, ready to pounce on whatever meager surplus you've managed to save. The king demands his due, and so does the church. Tithes, taxes, and rents, the holy trinity of peasant misery. It's enough to make you wonder if there's any justice in the world. But then again, when you're scraping by on the edge of starvation, existential questions tend to take a back seat to more pressing concerns, like how to keep your family fed and warm. If you think life as a medieval peasant is a pastoral dream, it's time for a reality check. It's a constant hustle, a balancing act where one wrong move could send you tumbling into the abyss of famine. You're part of a cycle that's been spinning for centuries, a cog in the great wheel of medieval life. And while that might sound romantic in theory, in practice, it's a grind that leaves little room for anything but the essentials. So, as the days grow shorter and the nights colder, you buckle down and do what you must to face the winter chill. It's not about thriving, it's about surviving. With each sack of grain stored safely away, with every salted ham hung to cure, you're one step closer to making it through to the other side of winter. And in a world where the line between life and death is as thin as a sheet of ice, that's no small feat. Winter's chill is creeping in, and you're not just worried about food. You've got to figure out how to keep that medieval draft from turning your home into a medieval icebox. Brace yourself, because we're diving into the fascinating world of medieval architecture, where necessity was the mother of some truly inventive solutions. Let's start with the basics. Your medieval home isn't winning any awards for luxury. Forget about central heating or double-glazed windows. Your house is a humble assembly of mud, straw, and maybe the odd stone if you're lucky. The walls, they're made of wattle and daub, a charmingly quaint-sounding mixture that's essentially sticks woven together with mud plastered on top. It might not sound like much, But when you're working with limited resources, it's an ingenious way to keep the elements at bay. Now, let's talk about that roof over your head. If you think having a thatched roof sounds romantic, think again. Thatch is basically dried vegetation, like straw or reeds, layered thick on top of wooden beams. While it does a decent job of keeping rain out, it's the medieval equivalent of living under a bird's nest. You've got to maintain it regularly, or you might end up with unwanted critters sharing your living space. Oh, and one stray spark from the hearth. Goodbye, roof. Speaking of hearths, they're the heart of the home. Literally, the only source of warmth and light. But before you start imagining cozy evenings by the fire, let's set the record straight. The hearth is about as romantic as a smoke detector malfunction. With no chimneys, the smoke just drifts up and out through a hole in the roof, if you're lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, you're living in a medieval sauna, with your eyes watering and your lungs getting a workout. But hey, at least the smoke keeps the bugs at bay, right? When it comes to keeping warm, medieval folks weren't just relying on their DIY insulation skills. Communal living was key. Picture this. Your home is a one-room wonder shared with your family, and quite likely some livestock. Cows, sheep, and chickens aren't just barnyard pals. They're also heat sources. Their body heat adds a few precious degrees to the room's temperature. It's cozy, sure, but also fragrant in a way that only medieval history can truly capture. But there's more to this than just keeping warm. The design of these homes was a testament to the medieval mindset, efficiency in every sense. The layout was open, with everything you needed within arm's reach. No separate rooms or corridors to heat, just a central space where living, eating, and sleeping all happened. It's the ultimate open concept living, long before it became a buzzword in modern real estate. Let's not forget the economic angle here. Building materials weren't just chosen for their insulation properties. They were what you could find or afford. Wattle and daub was the medieval equivalent of budget-friendly construction. Stones, if used, were often scavenged from old Roman ruins or local quarries, which weren't exactly just around the corner. Transporting heavy materials over long distances was labor-intensive and expensive. If you could avoid it, you would. Now, about those myths of medieval homes being cozy little cottages. They were more like survival pods. The reality was cramped, smoky, and let's face it, a bit grimy. But it was also a marvel of resourcefulness. People made do with what they had, crafting homes that met their needs and their budgets. It was less about aesthetics and more about practicality, though the nostalgia of rustic charm certainly has its appeal. That's the thing about history. It's easy to get swept up in the romance of it all. The truth is, medieval life was a balancing act of ingenuity and endurance. Every decision, from the materials used to the structure's design, was driven by the harsh realities of the time. It's a testament to human resilience, a reminder that even in the direst of circumstances, people find ways to adapt and survive. As you brace for the winter ahead, the focus remains on making the best of a tough situation. Your home might not be winning any design awards, but it's a fortress against the cold, a place where you and yours can huddle together, sharing warmth and stories, waiting for spring to return. And in a world where survival is the name of the game, that's the best kind of home you could hope for. As you huddle together in your medieval fortress against the cold, you quickly realize you're not just fighting off winter's chill. No, you're also keeping the long nights from becoming a descent into cabin fever. Enter the medieval version of Netflix, storytelling. When the sun sets before dinner and the wind howls like a pack of hungry wolves, it's all about finding a way to pass the time that doesn't involve staring at each other in frosty silence. Storytelling in medieval times was more than just a pastime. It was a lifeline. Your average peasant couldn't read or write. Literacy was as rare as a sunny January day. So, stories were the primary way to share knowledge, history, and a bit of escapism. Picture it, the fire crackling, the shadows dancing on the walls, and an elder weaving tales of daring knights, cunning foxes, and maybe a dragon or two. It's part history lesson, part entertainment, and all communal glue. Now, before you get too swept up in the romance of it all, let's remember these sessions weren't exactly harmonious cumbaya circles. Sure, there was camaraderie, but also the occasional spat over whose turn it was to tell a story, or whose goat was chewing on the storyteller's thatch. Tensions rose as easily as the smoke in your one-room abode. Winter, it turns out, was as much a test of social endurance as it was of physical survival. And then there's the church. Always the church. Its calendar was as omnipresent as the cold itself, dictating the rhythm of life with an ironclad schedule of feasts and fasts. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, each marked by rituals, and more importantly, a break in the monotony of winter. These holy days were the medieval equivalent of a surprise day off, complete with communal meals and a chance to let your hair down, or at least let your hood slip a little. Shared meals were the cornerstone of these gatherings. Imagine a potluck where everyone contributes what little they can spare. It's not a feast by any modern standard, but in a world where hunger is a constant companion, it's a chance to break bread together, literally and figuratively. A thick pottage, some hard bread, maybe a bit of cheese if you're lucky. The wine, watered down as it might be, flows a little more freely, loosening tongues and smoothing over grudges. But let's talk about those grudges. The myth of the idyllic village life, more fiction than fact. Sure, there's a sense of community, but it's also a pressure cooker of personalities and petty feuds. If you think your neighbor disputes are bad, try living in a place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and privacy is as scarce as a warm summer breeze. Land disputes, accusations of theft, and disagreements over tithes could turn a peaceful village into a simmering cauldron of resentment. Speaking of tithes, the church wasn't just a spiritual guide. It was a landlord with a taste for worldly goods. 1/10 of your produce went straight to the clergy, a hefty price for salvation in an already tight economy. It wasn't just the church's demands that stoked fires of discontent. Local lords, with their own taxes and whims, were equally burdensome. The medieval peasant was caught in a tug-of-war between earthly and divine authorities, both of which had a knack for claiming more than their fair share. And yet, through the smoke and grumbles, there was resilience. The communal activities, the shared meals, the stories, they were more than mere distractions. They were a means of survival as crucial as the food stores and the thatched roofs. They knit the community together, providing warmth that even the most robust hearth couldn't muster. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to find light in the darkest times, even if that light is a flickering candle in a drafty room. So, as the winter drags on and the stories continue to be spun, remember that the medieval peasant's world was one of contrasts. It was a place where community and conflict coexisted, where faith and frustration went hand in hand. And through it all, life carried on, one story, one meal, and one winter day at a time. As the flickering candlelight dances across the room, you're reminded that surviving a medieval winter is like playing a game of culinary Tetris. It's all about fitting the right pieces together to make it through to spring without succumbing to malnutrition or monotony-induced madness. Let's dive into the medieval pantry, where pottage reigns supreme and the reality of scarcity hits harder than a January frost. Ah, pottage. If there were a medieval equivalent of the little black dress, this humble stew would be it. Pottage was versatile, dependable, and utterly inescapable. Essentially a porridge/soup, it involved simmering whatever grains or legumes you had on hand with veggies, herbs, and maybe a scrap of meat, if fortune smiled upon you. It's less a recipe and more of an edible lifeline, adapting to whatever ingredients you could scrounge up. Now, before you let visions of hearty, steaming bowls dance in your head, let's clear something up. Pottage was more about sustenance than satisfaction. Picture this. You're sipping on the same murky broth day in and day out, a culinary Groundhog Day that rarely changes. In a world where peasants had the nutritional variety of a cardboard diet, this dish was a constant companion. It filled bellies, but it didn't exactly inspire culinary sonnets. But why was pottage so prevalent? Simply put, it was a matter of efficiency and necessity. Grains like barley, oats, and rye were accessible and could be stored for long periods. A peasant's best bet when fresh produce was as scarce as a warm day in January. Add a handful of dried peas or beans for protein, and you're basically taking a multivitamin medieval style. Yet, despite its ubiquity, pottage couldn't cover every nutritional base. You see, medieval peasants faced a dietary catch-22. The agricultural calendar dictated their meals, and winter was the bleakest chapter. Fresh fruits and vegetables were a distant memory, leaving folks to rely on stored, dried, or preserved foods. Vitamin deficiencies were an all-too-common reality, with scurvy and pellagra lurking like boogeymen in the dark corners of the cottage. The romantic notion of abundant medieval feasts is a particularly stubborn myth. Sure, the upper crust might indulge in festivals of gluttony, but for the average peasant, these grand banquets were more fairy tale than fact. The truth was a stark contrast. The daily menu was as repetitive as a medieval bard with a one-song repertoire. Bread, pottage, and the occasional salted fish or dried meat were the monotonous melody of the winter months. And let's not forget about the preservation game. In an era before refrigeration, preserving food was a high-stakes endeavor. Salt was the MVP of medieval preservation, but it came with a steep price tag. At about 6 pence a pound, it was as precious as a gold nugget to a peasant. Smoking and drying were other common techniques, but each required time, resources, and a touch of luck that the weather would cooperate. Yet, for all its challenges, the medieval diet was a reflection of the broader economic and social landscape. It was a system built on necessity and hierarchy, where what you ate was as much a statement of your social standing as your threadbare tunic. While the nobility dined on venison and fine pastries, the peasantry made do with gruel and hard cheese. It was the culinary embodiment of feudal inequality, with calories as the currency of survival. Now, let's talk about the consequences of this diet. Malnutrition wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a life-altering reality. We're talking stunted growth, weakened immune systems, a lifetime of health issues. When your diet is dictated by what you can grow, barter, or scavenge, there's little room for luxury. You're always one bad harvest away from disaster, and the specter of famine lurked like an uninvited guest at every meal. The truth is, medieval life was an unending hustle, where creativity and resourcefulness were as crucial as a good harvest. The harsh reality of scarcity was juxtaposed with the community's resilience. Peasants made do, creating meals that were simple but sustaining, and even found moments of joy in the shared struggle. That's the beauty of history. It's a tapestry woven with threads of human endurance, and even the humblest meal tells a story of survival. What's clear is that the medieval diet was not just about food. It was about life itself. It was a daily reminder of the precarious balance between abundance and deprivation, a lesson in humility taught by every mouthful of pottage. And as the winter days dragged on, each meal was both a challenge and a triumph, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure even the most trying times. So, as you sit by the hearth, spooning yet another bowl of pottage, remember that each bite is a connection to the past, a reminder of the grit and fortitude of those who came before. In a world where every crumb was a victory, the true feast was in the spirit of perseverance that defined the medieval experience. Hold tight to that bowl, because it's more than a meal. It's a legacy of survival. And there you are, cradling that humble bowl of pottage like it's a treasure map to survival, a culinary relic from a time when every meal was a minor miracle. Now, let's take a moment to zoom out and appreciate the sheer resilience of medieval peasants. These folks were the original survivalists, long before the term became synonymous with canned beans and basement bunkers. In today's world, where a power outage feels like a mini-apocalypse, medieval peasants would probably chuckle at our woes. For them, resilience wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was the only option. Imagine living in a world where Google Maps wasn't a thing, and your best bet for weather forecasting was the ache in your knee. Despite these limitations, peasants harnessed every ounce of ingenuity to navigate their harsh reality. Take food preservation, for instance. In the absence of refrigerators, these folks turned to the natural world for solutions. Salting, smoking, drying, the medieval trifecta of keeping food edible. Fast forward to today, and those techniques are making a comeback, albeit with a gourmet twist. Who knew that medieval survival tactics would become trendy culinary arts? It's enough to make you wonder if artisanal pottage is the next big thing. Economically, the medieval peasantry was a masterclass in resourcefulness. They were the OG recyclers, repurposing everything from animal bones to scraps of cloth. In a time when throwing something away was akin to financial heresy, every resource was maximized. The modern zero-waste movement has nothing on the medieval ethos of make do and mend. But let's not romanticize it too much. The reality was far grimmer than any Instagram post could capture. The notion of the noble peasant, a quaint, rosy-cheeked figure happily tilling the fields, is more myth than reality. The truth is, life was a constant battle against the elements, disease, and the whims of those in power. The average life expectancy, around 30-35 years if you were lucky. It was a grind, plain and simple. Now, if you're thinking, well, at least they had a strong community, you're partly right. Community was indeed a cornerstone of peasant life, but it wasn't all cumbear and communal hugs. Villages could be as cutthroat as any corporate boardroom, with disputes over land, resources, and social standing simmering beneath the surface. Sure, there was support, but there was also a healthy dose of rivalry and suspicion. Think of the medieval community as a high-stakes game of survivor, where alliances were crucial, but trust was a luxury. You relied on your neighbors, but you also kept an eye on that one guy who always seemed a little too interested in your cabbage patch. It was a delicate balance, a social tightrope walk where one misstep could mean disaster. But here's the kicker. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, medieval peasants developed a resilience that's nothing short of inspiring. They didn't just survive. They adapted, innovated, and occasionally thrived. They turned scarcity into creativity, and their legacy is a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Fast forward to the present, and we find ourselves facing new challenges that echo the medieval struggle in surprising ways. Climate change, economic inequality, and social unrest are the modern dragons we must slay. And while we have the luxury of technology and resources that our medieval ancestors couldn't have imagined, their lessons in resilience and community are more relevant than ever. There's a certain romantic appeal to the idea of the simple life, but the reality was anything but simple. It was a constant hustle, a relentless pursuit of survival in a world that offered little mercy. Yet, through it all, the medieval peasant story is one of hope and perseverance. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, where the line between life and death was as thin as a wattle and daub wall, humanity finds a way to endure. So, next time you're tempted to complain about the Wi-Fi being down, remember the peasants huddled around their smoky hearths, swapping stories and sharing what little they had. Their legacy isn't just the pottage or the thatched roofs. It's the resilience that allowed them to keep going, one day at a time. In a world where everything seemed stacked against them, they proved that the human spirit is a force to be reckoned with, capable of weathering any storm, medieval or modern. And there you have it, folks. The medieval peasant, heroically mundane, endlessly resourceful, and above all, resilient, a testament to the power of community and the human capacity to adapt. Their story remains a beacon of hope and a reminder of our shared history. As we face our own challenges, let's carry forward their legacy of grit and determination, ensuring that, like them, we too find ways to thrive, even when survival seems like the only goal. You're hunched over a desk that would make a modern office worker scream for ergonomic intervention. But guess what? You're a medieval scribe, and complaints are not part of the job description. Welcome to the 9 to 5, or more like dawn to dusk, grind of copying manuscripts in a chilly, dimly lit scriptorium. We're talking about a time when the phrase copy and paste meant months of meticulous labor. Start with a little backstory. It's the Middle Ages, and your gig as a scribe is essential for preserving the intellectual lifeblood of your era. In a world where the printing press is still a few centuries away, you and your ink-stained brethren are the keepers of knowledge. Monasteries are the epicenters of this literary world, and you're likely stationed in one of these stone fortresses of faith and learning. Think of it as a medieval we work for monks, minus the kombucha and casual Fridays. The daily routine is not for the faint-hearted. Your morning begins with the tolling of a bell, not an alarm clock, summoning you to morning prayers. After that spiritual pick-me-up, it's time to dive into the day's labor. You shuffle into the scriptorium, a room that's as much a test of endurance as any modern gym. Cramped desks, hard benches, and a windowless space lit by flickering candles. It's a setup that screams productivity, right? And forget central heating. You've got layers of wool and a small brazier that does little more than smoke up the place. Now, let's talk about the glamour of your tools. A quill, some ink, and parchment or vellum. This isn't your everyday paper, folks. Vellum is made from calfskin, while parchment comes from sheep or goats. It's expensive and labor-intensive to produce, so every slip of the pen feels like a minor catastrophe. And that's before we even get into the ink, a concoction made from oak galls, iron salts, and a binding agent like gum arabic. Think of it as the original artisanal ink, complete with the occasional smudge and blotch. The physical toll of this work is no joke. Eye strain. Oh, you bet. You're squinting at tiny script in poor lighting, and glasses aren't really a thing yet. Back pain. Absolutely. Those hard benches don't do your spine any favors, and ergonomic chairs are as mythical as unicorns in this era. Your hands cramp from the constant motion of writing, and when you're not copying text, you're illuminating manuscripts with intricate designs and vibrant colors. It's a meticulous art form that requires a steady hand and a lot of patience, something to ponder next time you're doodling on a notepad during a meeting. Sure, there's a certain romance to the idea of being a scribe, a guardian of knowledge in an age of ignorance. But let's cut the medieval romance with a dose of reality. It's grueling work, and while you're contributing to the preservation of culture, you're also just one bad ink spill away from a week's worth of work down the drain. No pressure, right? The scriptorium isn't just a workplace. It's a classroom and a sanctuary. You're surrounded by fellow scribes, some of whom have been at it for decades. They pass down techniques on how to mix pigments and craft the perfect quill. There's camaraderie in the shared struggle, a collective sigh when a manuscript is finally completed, and a grim determination to start all over again with the next one. Your role is vital, yet anonymous. Few will know your name or recognize your work unless you sneak a little marginalia, those cheeky notes or doodle scribes sometimes left in the margins. It's your way of saying, I was here. A small act of rebellion against the anonymity of your labor. It's a reminder that even in the most monotonous of tasks, there lies a spark of creativity and humor. So, as you settle in for another day of relentless copying, remember that you're part of a long tradition. You're a bridge between the past and the future, a silent craftsman whose work will outlast you by centuries. It's a noble task, but let's not sugarcoat it. It's hard, thankless, and as anyone who's suffered a paper cut can tell you, surprisingly painful at times. Welcome to the life of a medieval scribe. Equal parts drudgery, dedication, and the occasional dash of defiance. And speaking of pain and patience, let's talk about the real downer of being you, a medieval scribe. The cold, hard cash, or should I say the distinct lack thereof. You see, the paycheck for a scribe wasn't exactly the stuff of dreams. In fact, if you were hoping to live like a medieval Mogul, you're in for a rude awakening. Your earnings as a scribe were less about making it rain and more about making ends meet, barely. Let's dive into some numbers, shall we? In 14th century England, a skilled artisan might pull in about 8 pence a day, while you, dear scribe, are looking at a wage of around 2 to 4 pence. Not exactly a king's ransom, is it? With the cost of living on the rise, thanks to charming little events like the Black Death, which, while reducing the population, also drove up the price of goods, you're practically scribbling for scraps. Bread, a staple, could cost you a whole penny, and meat, forget about it. That was a luxury reserved for feast days and fancier folk. But why such paltry pay for such painstaking work? Well, it's a classic case of supply and demand, or rather, the lack of supply. Literacy was a rare skill, more precious than a dragon's hoard. Yet, despite the scarcity of literate individuals, the demand for scribes was relatively low. Monasteries and the church, your primary employers, had their own stable of scribes who worked more out of religious duty than financial incentive. After all, when your boss is the Almighty, you don't exactly get to negotiate a better rate. And then there's the cost of doing business. Let's talk parchment. This stuff is the medieval equivalent of buying a high-end laptop. Preparing one sheet of parchment from animal hide was a laborious process involving soaking, stretching, and scraping. It could take days to complete. The cost, depending on the quality, anywhere from 3 to 5 pence per sheet. Considering the average manuscript could run hundreds of pages, you can see why every slip of the pen felt like a wallet-punching catastrophe. Ink didn't come cheap either. Crafting that rich, dark liquid required oak galls, which might sound like a medieval snack, but are actually growths found on oak trees. When mixed with iron salts and a binding agent like gum arabic, you get ink potent enough to last centuries. But this wasn't a quick trip to the medieval equivalent of staples. This was a process, folks, and an expensive one at that. The economic realities of being a scribe meant you were often living at the mercy of your patrons. Wealthy benefactors and the church funded your work, providing room and board in lieu of a hefty salary. It wasn't uncommon for scribes to live in communal settings, sharing resources and relying on the monastic community for sustenance. Think of it as medieval socialism, but instead of free healthcare, you got free sermons. Yet despite the financial strain, the life of a scribe wasn't entirely without its perks. For one, your work offered a level of intellectual engagement that many medieval professions lacked. While your neighbor was neck-deep in muck, trying to coax crops from the stingy soil, you were engaging with texts that spanned the worlds of theology, philosophy, and occasionally science. It was a rare privilege to be part of the intellectual elite, even if your earnings argued otherwise. So, why did anyone bother picking up the quill in the first place? Well, for many, it was about more than just money. There was a sense of calling, a devotion to a higher purpose. You were part of a tradition that stretched back centuries, a guardian of knowledge in a world teetering on the edge of the Dark Ages. The romantic notion of preserving wisdom resonated deeply, even when the practicalities were less than glamorous. And let's not forget the social status. While a scribe wasn't exactly a rock star, you did garner a certain respect within the monastic walls. Your skills were rare, your knowledge deep, and your work crucial. It was a noble endeavor, with the scriptorium serving as a refuge for those who valued intellect over coin. In the end, being a scribe was less about the economic gain and more about the intellectual and spiritual riches. It was a commitment to a cause greater than oneself, a beacon of light in an era shadowed by ignorance and superstition. Sure, the pay was pitiful, but the legacy, priceless. As you dip your quill into the ink for yet another day of painstaking transcription, take solace in the fact that your contribution to history is as indelible as the ink on your parchment. But don't get too comfortable. After all, you're just one ink spill away from starting over. Again. But before your quill even touches the parchment, let's pause to unravel the tangled web of social and political strings that puppeteer your life as a medieval scribe. Welcome to the church's world, where education and literacy are as tightly controlled as the latest iPhone release. And you, dear scribe, are smack dab in the middle of it all. In the medieval era, the church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the Facebook, Google, and Harvard of its time, controlling information, education, and the moral compass of society. So, when it came to the written word, the church was the ultimate gatekeeper. They decided what was worth preserving, copying, and disseminating. If a text didn't align with their celestial playbook, well, tough luck. It was probably getting a one-way ticket to obscurity. Let's talk about numbers for a second. By the 12th century, about 90% of book production was happening in monasteries. That's a monopoly that even modern tech giants would envy. If you wanted to learn to read or write, you were likely learning the Latin of the church, not the vernacular of the masses. The church effectively controlled the keys to the kingdom of knowledge, and you, humble scribe, were one of the few who could navigate its labyrinthine corridors. Now, let's unpack the scribe's relationship with wealthy patrons, a dynamic as predictable as a medieval weather forecast and just as changeable. These patrons, usually aristocrats or high-ranking clergy, were the ones footing the bill for your ink-stained endeavors. They'd commission works that aligned with their interests, whether religious texts, legal documents, or grandiose family histories. And let's face it, history is often written by those who can afford the ink. The problem here, creative freedom was as scarce as a dragon in the local tavern. Your patrons' whims dictated your workload and subsequently your paycheck. If they wanted a flattering biography that glossed over their less-than-savory exploits, guess whose job it was to make that happen? That's right, you, the scribe, the original ghostwriter long before it was cool. But don't get the wrong idea. Being at the mercy of patrons wasn't all bad. It did keep the ink flowing and the parchment stocked. However, it also meant walking a tightrope between integrity and survival. You couldn't afford to bite the hand that fed you, literally and figuratively. The church and its patrons held the purse strings, and one wrong move could leave you out in the cold, quite literally. Think about it. You're crammed into a monastic scriptorium, meticulously copying the works commissioned by those who can afford your services. But what about the texts that didn't make the cut? The stories of ordinary people, the folk tales, the songs sung in taverns. Those narratives often vanished into the ether, unrecorded and forgotten. It's a stark reminder that history, for all its grandeur, is often an echo chamber of the elite. That's not to say there wasn't room for a little rebellion. Scribes, ever resourceful, found ways to leave their mark. Marginalia, those cheeky notes and doodles scrawled in the margins, offered a glimpse into the scribe's mind, a subversive commentary on the world they inhabited. It was a small act of defiance, a whisper of individuality in an otherwise homogenized manuscript. But let's get back to the church's grip on education. We're talking about an institution that knew the power of the written word and wielded it like a medieval broadsword. Literacy was a currency of power, and the church was rolling in it. They had the resources to educate a select few, ensuring that those who could read or write did so in service to God, or more accurately, the church's interpretation of divine will. The average peasant. Well, they were too busy trying to survive to worry about reading the latest theological debate. For them, knowledge came in the form of oral traditions, passed down through generations. The church, with its libraries and scriptoria, held the monopoly on written knowledge, and by extension, the power to shape culture and society. Let's not forget the political clout the church wielded. In a world where kings and emperors rose and fell, the church remained a steadfast pillar of authority. They could excommunicate rulers, influence wars, and dictate moral standards. And you, as a scribe, were a small cog in this vast machine, a craftsman whose work contributed to the church's power and prestige. Now, you might be wondering, why did these scribes keep at it? The answer lies in a curious blend of faith, duty, and a smidgen of ambition. For many, the scriptorium was a place of contemplation, a sanctuary from the chaos of the medieval world. It offered a sense of purpose, a connection to something greater than oneself. And let's not discount the allure of being part of the intellectual elite, even if the pay was more pauper than prince. Yet, despite the church's tight grip on literacy and the scribe's dependency on patrons, there was an undeniable allure to the written word. Books were rare treasures, coveted and cherished. To be a scribe was to be part of a select group, guardians of knowledge in a world where ignorance was the norm. It was a noble calling, even if the practicalities were less than glamorous. So, as you dip your quill and prepare to face another day of painstaking transcription, remember that you're part of a grand tradition, one that's as much about preserving the past as it is about shaping the future. You're a bridge between worlds, a silent craftsman whose work will echo down the corridors of time. Just watch out for those ink spills. They're a real mood killer. So, as you dip your quill and prepare to face another day of painstaking transcription, let's unravel the not-so-glamorous reality of being a medieval scribe. Forget the Hollywood-esque vision of peaceful scholars lounging in sun-dappled cloisters, leisurely penning the secrets of the universe. Toss that image out the window, or, in your case, a tiny slit in the stone wall pretending to be a window. Here's the gritty truth. The life of a scribe was less about serene contemplation and more about relentless hustle. Imagine clocking into a job where every letter, every word had to be perfect. No backspace, no Control+Z. One slip of the quill and you could kiss that crisp piece of vellum goodbye, right along with your weekly wages. The pressure was real, folks, and the stakes were higher than a medieval knight on a warhorse. Let's break down this romantic myth of the scholarly scribe. The idea of a scribe as a peaceful, learned soul is appealing, sure. Who wouldn't want to picture themselves as a guardian of knowledge, sipping on metaphoric intellectual wine while the rest of the world flounders in the muddy waters of ignorance? But the reality, it was a slog, and not the kind that comes with a sense of accomplishment at the end of the day. We're talking back-breaking, mind-numbing, eye-straining work that made modern data entry look like a walk in the park. The labor was repetitive, and the monotony was as comforting as a splash of cold water during morning prayers. You'd spend hours copying the same text over and over, fighting off the creeping dread of making a mistake. And make no mistake, mistakes were a big deal. An error could mean starting over, and starting over meant more time, more resources, and more frustration. Think of it as medieval Groundhog Day, but instead of Bill Murray, you're stuck with a quill and ink. And let's not forget the delightful pressure cooker environment. The scriptorium was no quiet library sanctuary. It was a buzzing, bustling hub of activity. The air was thick with the smell of ink and candle smoke, and the constant shuffling and muttering of your fellow scribes provided a background soundtrack that was anything but soothing. You were part of a human assembly line, churning out text like a medieval Kinko's, but without the luxury of modern copy machines. Now, let's talk consequences. In today's world, a typo may earn you a stern email from your boss or a snarky comment from a colleague. Back then, a single mistake could lead to a cascade of professional and personal disasters. You could find yourself docked pay, which, given the already paltry wages, was enough to throw your entire month into chaos. Worse, in some cases, scribes faced public humiliation or punishment for their errors. Imagine the medieval version of being called out in a company-wide email, but instead of a digital reprimand, you literally got put in the stocks. And the fun didn't stop there. The economic realities of scribing meant that mistakes could cost you more than just your pride. Remember, parchment was expensive, 3 to 5 pence per sheet, with a single manuscript running into the hundreds of pages. A botched page wasn't just a stray mark on your employment record. It was a significant financial blow. This isn't to say there wasn't a pinch of romance in scribing. After all, you were still a custodian of culture, even if the job came with more headaches than hallelujahs. The allure of safeguarding the wisdom of the ages wasn't entirely lost, even if it was overshadowed by the looming threat of making a costly error. But let's dig deeper into why this image of the scholarly scribe persists. There's something inherently appealing about the idea of solitary intellectual pursuit, of being so engrossed in the written word that the outside world fades away. It's a fantasy of escape, of finding purpose in meticulous work. Yet, for the medieval scribe, that fantasy was often more of a nightmare. The pressure to avoid mistakes was relentless, and while it's easy to romanticize the dedication to craftsmanship, living under that constant strain was anything but idyllic. The reality was a balancing act between the demands of your patrons and the constraints of your resources. One misstep, and you were scrambling to make up for lost time and materials. And let's not ignore the personal toll. The physical demands of the job were grueling. Those cramped desks and flickering candles weren't doing you any favors. Eye strain was a constant companion, and back pain was a given. In a world without aspirin or ergonomic chairs, the toll on your body was just another part of the daily grind. Despite all this, the myth of the peaceful, scholarly scribe endures. Perhaps it's because, deep down, we all long for a sense of purpose, for work that feels meaningful. The image of the scribe offers a tantalizing glimpse of that ideal, even if the reality was far more brutal. So, as you soldier on in your dimly lit corner of the scriptorium, remember that while the myth may be appealing, the reality was a different beast altogether. You were part of a tradition that was as demanding as it was noble, and while the pressure and monotony were real, so too was the unparalleled privilege of being a bridge between worlds. Just remember to keep that quill steady. The stakes are high, and there's no room for error in this medieval marathon of the mind. But hold onto your quill, because this medieval marathon is about to hit a seismic shift that will make even the most jaded scribe sit up and spill his ink. Enter Johannes Gutenberg and his little invention that's about to rock the scriptorium, the printing press. Now, this contraption was the medieval equivalent of dropping a smartphone into a village of rotary phones. Imagine going from painstakingly hand-copying manuscripts to banging out pages faster than you can say illuminated manuscript. We're talking about a technology so revolutionary, it's like swapping your rickety wooden cart for a Ferrari. Let's get some numbers on the table. Gutenberg's first major printed work, the famous 42-line Bible, appeared around 1455. Before this, creating a single book could take a scribe months or even years. With the press, you could churn out multiple copies in a fraction of the time. Suddenly, books were no longer the exclusive domain of monasteries and the elite. By 1500, just half a century after Gutenberg's Bible hit the scene, there were about 1,000 printing presses in operation across Europe, producing millions of copies of books. Talk about a game changer. For scribes, this technological leap was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it meant more books, more knowledge, and more access for the masses. On the other hand, it was a bit like waking up to find your job outsourced to a machine that never sleeps, never eats, and definitely doesn't need a break to stretch its aching back. It's no wonder that some scribes might have looked at Gutenberg's invention with the same enthusiasm as a medieval knight facing his first encounter with gunpowder. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this democratization of knowledge. The church, that old gatekeeper of the written word, was suddenly faced with the prospect of losing its monopoly on information. No longer could it control which texts were copied and disseminated. The printing press was like the medieval internet, unleashing a torrent of ideas, opinions, and information that could be as enlightening as it was incendiary. But let's spare a thought for the scribes themselves, those custodians of knowledge whose world was tipping on its axis. The profession that had been their livelihood, their calling, was rapidly becoming obsolete. Imagine spending your life perfecting a craft, only to find that a machine can do it faster, cheaper, and on a scale you could never match. It's like spending decades mastering the art of candle making, only for someone to flick a switch and flood the room with electric light. This wasn't just a professional blow, it was a cultural shift. Scribes were more than just copyists. They were artists, scholars, and gatekeepers of tradition. The printing press was the herald of a new era, one where the written word was no longer a sacred, labor-intensive artifact, but a commodity. The art of illumination, the painstaking decoration of manuscripts, was suddenly less in demand. The intricate marginalia that offered a peek into the scribe's world, it became a quaint relic of a bygone age. Yet, despite the upheaval, the legacy of the scribes endured. They had laid the groundwork for this explosion of knowledge, ensuring that the works of antiquity survived to be printed and shared. Without their meticulous efforts, Gutenberg might have had little to print. It's a bittersweet irony that the very tradition that the scribes upheld was what made the printing revolution possible. They were the unsung heroes of the literary world, their ink-stained fingers paving the way for an era of enlightenment and discovery. So, what's the takeaway from this tale of ink and innovation? In a world where technology is constantly reshaping the job market, the story of the scribes is a reminder that progress is a double-edged sword, brings with it both opportunity and obsolescence, forcing us to adapt or be left behind. Even as the scribes faced the sunset of their profession, their contributions to history were indelible, etched in the pages of the books they so carefully copied. As you close this chapter on the life of a medieval scribe, remember that while the tools and methods may change, the pursuit of knowledge and the preservation of culture endure. The scribes may have faded into the annals of history, their quills quieted by the clatter of the printing press, but their legacy is as vibrant as ever. They were the bridges between the world of handwritten manuscripts and printed books, their work a testament to the enduring power of the written word. In the end, the story of the scribe is more than just a tale of ink and parchment. It's a reflection of our own journey through history. It's about the relentless pursuit of knowledge, the tireless dedication to craft, and the bittersweet dance with progress. So, next time you flip through a book or scroll through a digital page, spare a thought for those who came before, the ink-stained hands that laid the foundation for the world of words we now take for granted. And maybe, just maybe, give a silent nod to the scribes, those unsung heroes of the medieval world, whose legacy continues to shape our own. If you ever found yourself in the dense jungles of Mesoamerica around, say, 250 AD, you'd be stumbling upon one of history's most fascinating societies, the ancient Maya. This isn't your average ancient civilization with a couple of stone tools and a rudimentary calendar. We're talking about a people with a flair for grand architecture, astronomical precision, and social structure as complex as the software in your smartphone. But let's dive into the top of the social pyramid first. The kings, or Ajor, whose lives were a mix of divine right and the kind of pomp that would make a modern royal wedding look like a casual barbecue. The Ajor were no ordinary rulers. They were considered semi-divine beings. And if you think modern politicians have an image problem, imagine trying to maintain your godly status while managing a city-state's economy and defending against rival kingdoms. They had full-time jobs in PR, theology, and military strategy. Oh, and let's not forget their role as the chief priest. Talk about multitasking. The court of an Ajor was like a 24/7 reality show with a cast of nobles, scribes, architects, and artisans. These folks weren't just sitting around playing ancient board games. They were busy making the king look good, literally carving his victories and divine ancestry into stone. The Maya didn't have Instagram, but they did have stelae, large stone slabs that served as public relations billboards. These inscriptions weren't just about telling time or marking territorial boundaries. They were about broadcasting the king's divine prowess and keeping the common folk in awe. Now, while the Ajor and his court were wrapped in luxurious textiles, think vibrant reds and rich blues made from the precious dyes they traded for miles around, the commoners were living a bit differently. Picture this. Life for the average Maya was less about ceremonial grandeur and more about the daily grind. Farming corn, beans, squash, and chilies wasn't just a dietary choice, it was survival. And while you might find the occasional Maya farmer sporting a stylish feathered headdress for special occasions, most days they were decked out in simple, functional clothing made from woven fibers. The economic gap between the rulers and the ruled wasn't just about clothing or housing, it was systemic. The Maya economy was based on a system of tribute and labor. Commoners provided the food, goods, and manpower that kept the city-states running, while the elite enjoyed the fruits of these labors in their palatial homes. We're talking about an economy where wealth wasn't measured in coins or cash, but in cacao beans, obsidian, and the labor of millions. It's easy to get caught up in the romance of the Maya as mystical astronomers and builders of majestic pyramids, but the Popol Vuh, a sacred book of the Maya, reveals a society deeply concerned with order and hierarchy. The gods created humans from maize, after all, emphasizing the importance of agriculture, and by extension, the farmer's place in the cosmic order. Yet in practice, the commoner's cosmic significance didn't exactly translate to social mobility. Think of it as being crucial to the operation of a company, but never getting a corner office. Yet, despite the rigid hierarchy, the Maya world was anything but static. Trade routes crisscrossed the region, connecting city-states like Tikal, Palenque, and Kapan over hundreds of miles. These were bustling hubs of commerce and culture, where goods and ideas flowed as freely as any ancient version of the Internet. The networks were so extensive that a piece of jade from the highlands could end up in the lowlands, traded through countless hands, each adding a layer of value. Of course, all this trade and commerce didn't mean the Maya were living in a utopia of peace and prosperity. Far from it. Competition between city-states was fierce, with wars over resources, tribute, and territory. The life of an Ajor was less about sipping cacao in golden goblets and more about ensuring your head didn't end up as a trophy in a rival's palace. And while the Popol Vuh might wax poetic about creation myths and hero twins, it also reflects a society where power was often maintained through force and fear. The Maya kings were masterful at using religious rituals to reinforce their rule, orchestrating elaborate ceremonies that showcased their connection to the gods. But let's not romanticize it too much. These events were as much about political theater as they were about spirituality. The Ajor's ability to predict celestial events, thanks to their highly advanced understanding of astronomy, wasn't just a fun party trick. It was a way to legitimize their power, convincing the masses that their ruler was indeed in sync with the cosmos. The commoners, meanwhile, had their own rituals and beliefs, often centered around agriculture and community. Their lives were dictated by the cycles of the seasons and the demands of the land. They might not have had front-row seats at the grand ceremonies in the king's court, but their own festivals and traditions were rich and vibrant, reflecting a deep connection to the earth and their ancestors. In the end, the Maya civilization was a tapestry of contrasts: divine kings and humble farmers, grand cities and rural villages, cosmic myths and harsh realities. And while we might be tempted to view the Maya through a lens of mystery and mysticism, the truth is that they were as pragmatic as they were visionary. Their social hierarchy, with all its complexities and contradictions, was a testament to a society that, like ours, grappled with questions of power, privilege, and the human condition. Now, let's shift our gaze slightly down the social hierarchy to the noble class and priests, the real power players lurking behind the Ajor's grandiose shadow. Think of them as the original influencers, wielding their clout not with hashtags and selfies, but through rituals, and more importantly, cacao beans. Yes, those precious little seeds were the secret source of the Maya economy, used as currency long before chocolate bars made them a pantry staple. The noble class was like a medieval LinkedIn, a network of individuals who traded in prestige and influence. They didn't just sit around wearing feathered headdresses, although they did love a good accessory. These nobles were the king's right-hand men and women, because gender roles in Maya society were surprisingly flexible. They managed estates, collected tributes, and sometimes even led armies. Quite the resume, right? Priests, on the other hand, were the spiritual heavyweights. They held the keys to the cosmos, and by that I mean they could make or break a king's public image faster than you can say divine intervention. Their job was to interpret celestial events, conduct ceremonies, and maintain the favor of the gods. If a priest said the gods were displeased, well, that was the kind of bad PR even an Ajor couldn't afford. Essentially, they were the cosmic meteorologists of their day, and like today's weather forecasters, they sometimes got it wrong. But when they got it right, jackpot. Let's talk cacao, though. These beans weren't merely a tasty treat. They were the backbone of the economy. Imagine strolling through a Maya market, your wallet full of cacao beans, ready to trade for goods. And cacao wasn't just for the elite. Commoners used it too, though more sparingly, as a luxury item rather than everyday currency. You might think of this as an ancient precursor to cryptocurrency, but with a flavor profile. The elite would enjoy frothy cacao drinks, sometimes spiced with chilies, in ornate vessels during lavish feasts, demonstrating their wealth and sophistication. It's fascinating to note how the priest's celestial predictions could sway cacao markets. If a priest predicted a bountiful harvest, the price of cacao might drop due to expected abundance, whereas a prediction of lean times could send prices soaring. This kind of economic influence meant that priests were akin to financial analysts with a penchant for ornate rituals. Speaking of rituals, these were grand affairs. Sacrifices, bloodlettings, and otherworldly dances were orchestrated with the precision of a Broadway show. But before you get lost in the romance of it all, remember that these weren't just spiritual exercises. They were political theater. A successful ceremony could cement a ruler's power, while a botched one could lead to unrest. The stakes were high, and the priests were the directors, ensuring the show went off without a hitch. The noble class and priests were experts at maintaining the delicate balance between religion, power, and economics. They understood that keeping the cosmic and earthly realms in harmony was essential for societal stability. The gods had to be appeased not just with words and rituals, but with tributes, often extracted from the common folk, and the nobles were the ones to ensure this flow of goods. They were the middle managers of the divine, if you will, and they ran a tight ship. For the Maya, the economic system was less about accumulating wealth and more about maintaining balance. Wealth was not hoarded in the way we think of today. It was redistributed through feasts, rituals, and tributes. This was a world where giving was just as important as receiving, a notion that might seem alien in today's economy-driven societies. But let's not romanticize it. This wasn't a benevolent redistribution. It was about demonstrating power and control and ensuring everyone knew their place in the cosmic order. The social structure of the Maya was a testament to their understanding of the interconnectedness of power, religion, and economics. The noble class and priests were the linchpins, holding the society together through a complex web of duties and influences. They understood that the economy wasn't just about cacao or jade. It was about the flow of power and the perception of divine favor. And while the Ajor might have been the figurehead, the nobles and priests were the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. They were the architects of public opinion, the manipulators of celestial and economic forces, ensuring that the king remained in the good graces of both the gods and the people. So next time you enjoy a chocolate bar, spare a thought for those ancient Maya priests and nobles. They might not have had social media, but they certainly knew how to work their influence. As we peel back the layers of Maya society, it's clear that their world was as rich and complex as the cacao they prized. The balance they maintained between religion, power, and economics was precarious, yet it endured for centuries. And while the Maya civilization eventually faced decline, the legacy of their social structure and economic ingenuity remains. But let's save that tale for another day. For now, let's just appreciate the sheer audacity of a society that used chocolate as currency and priests as cosmic influencers, weaving a tapestry of power that remains as fascinating today as it was 1,000 years ago. And speaking of weaving tapestries of power, let's unravel the role of the Maya merchant class, the middlemen and women, who kept the wheels of this intricate civilization spinning. Imagine the merchant as a sort of ancient Amazon, minus the 2-day shipping and Prime subscription, of course. These folks were the lifeblood of the Maya economy, navigating vast trade networks that could make even the most seasoned eBay sellers head spin. Merchants were the unsung heroes, or perhaps the unsung hustlers, of Maya society. They deftly maneuvered through an environment as complex as the algebra homework you've been avoiding. Forget about the internet. These traders had footpaths and canoe routes that crisscrossed Central America like a spider web of commerce. We're talking about routes stretching over 300 miles, connecting city-states like Tikal in modern-day Guatemala to the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. If you thought your morning commute was bad, try paddling a canoe loaded with jade and obsidian through dense jungle and unpredictable rivers. Let's not underestimate the significance of these goods. Jade and obsidian weren't just shiny baubles and sharp stones. They were the bling and blades of the ancient world. Jade was more than just eye candy. It was a status symbol, a spiritual talisman, and even a form of currency. The Maya prized it for its vibrant green hue and its association with life and fertility. Obsidian, on the other hand, was the razor-sharp cutting edge of Mesoamerican technology. It was used to craft weapons and tools that made Bronze Age counterparts look like blunt instruments. Think of obsidian as the original Swiss Army knife, versatile and indispensable. The merchant class, much like today's influencers, had the power to shape trends and tastes. They weren't just ferrying goods, they were spreading ideas, technologies, and even gossip. In a world without tabloids, merchants were the whispering winds carrying news of the latest political maneuverings or the juiciest royal scandals. Their networks were the veins through which the lifeblood of Maya culture flowed, connecting isolated communities and facilitating cultural exchange. They were the glue that held the disparate parts of the Maya world together, ensuring no city-state was left in the dark ages. Now, being a merchant wasn't all about exotic travel and glamorous wares. It was a risky business, fraught with danger and uncertainty. Banditry was a real threat, and let's just say the Maya jungles weren't exactly patrolled by friendly neighborhood Spider-Men. A merchant's journey could be cut short by everything from natural disasters to hostile warriors looking to add a few more trophies to their collection. Yet, the potential rewards were worth the peril. Successful merchants could amass considerable wealth and status, becoming power brokers who straddled the line between commoner and noble. In the grand scheme of things, merchants were the levelers of the Maya social hierarchy. They bridged the gap between the elite, who craved luxury items, and the common folk, who produced the raw materials. This wasn't some socialist utopia, but merchants did facilitate a kind of wealth distribution, albeit one that heavily favored the upper echelons. They were the original purveyors of trickle-down economics, with jade beads and cacao beans as the currency of choice. And here's where the myth-busting comes in. While it's tempting to romanticize these traders as noble explorers, they were often more pragmatic than poetic. Their motivations were less about cultural exchange and more about profit margins. After all, you don't haul a canoe full of cacao beans across crocodile-infested waters just for the love of adventure. They were the ultimate pragmatists, navigating both the literal and metaphorical waters of Maya society with a keen eye on the bottom line. But let's not forget the economic impact of their trade. By channeling goods across vast distances, merchants contributed to the economic complexity that allowed the Maya civilization to flourish. They helped create a web of interdependence that tied city-states together, allowing them to specialize and thrive. This interconnectedness was crucial in a world where self-sufficiency was often a matter of survival. In a way, merchants were the unsung architects of a civilization that, at its height, boasted a population of around 19 million people. Of course, the trade networks weren't just about goods and people. They were conduits for ideas, art, and religious practices, spreading innovations that would enrich the cultural tapestry of the Maya world. The merchant's role was thus central to the diffusion of Maya culture, ensuring it wasn't confined to isolated pockets, but instead permeated the region. So, the next time you click Buy Now on a new gadget, spare a thought for the Maya merchants who, in their own way, were the original pioneers of consumer culture. They may not have had drones or digital marketplaces, but they knew the value of a good trade route and the importance of keeping both sides of a deal happy. As we delve deeper into the complexities of Maya society, remember that behind every jade jewel and obsidian blade was a merchant who made it all possible. These were the unsung heroes, the deal-makers and risk-takers who kept the mighty Maya civilization humming along. And as we dig deeper into the layers of this ancient society, let's keep in mind the intricate web of commerce and culture that these merchants wove, a network that continues to captivate us today. And speaking of the web that merchants wove, let's take a closer look at the artisans and farmers, who were the true backbone of Maya society. Forget the glamorous lives of the Ajor or the cosmic influence of priests. These folks were the ones who kept the wheels of everyday life turning, albeit with little fanfare and a lot of elbow grease. First up, the artisans. You might picture these skilled workers as the hipsters of ancient Mesoamerica, crafting pottery and jewelry with a flair that would make Etsy sellers weep with envy. But their contributions went far beyond aesthetics. Artisans were crucial to the Maya economy and culture, producing goods that ranged from the intricately painted ceramics used in religious ceremonies to the everyday tools that kept households running smoothly. Let's get specific here. Maya pottery wasn't just about function, it was a canvas for storytelling. These ceramics often depicted scenes from mythology, history, and everyday life, serving as both practical items and cultural artifacts. The most talented artisans were akin to the rock stars of their time, their work commissioned by the elite and traded across vast distances. A well-crafted pot wasn't just a container, it was a status symbol, a piece of art, and a testament to the artisan's skill. But before we get lost in the romance of it all, let's debunk a myth. Artisans weren't living large in luxury. They were respected, sure, but they weren't rolling in jade beads. Their lives were marked by hard work, long hours, and the constant pressure to meet the demands of their patrons. Picture a modern-day graphic designer juggling multiple projects with tight deadlines, and you've got a pretty good idea of an artisan's daily grind. Now let's pivot to the farmers, the unsung heroes who literally put food on the table. In a society where maize was considered sacred, after all, the gods supposedly created humans from corn. Farming was more than just an occupation, it was a cosmic calling. The Maya agricultural calendar was a complex system, informed by celestial observations and deeply intertwined with religious rituals. Farmers weren't just tilling the soil, they were participating in a divine cycle of life and rebirth. And let's not gloss over the importance of maize. This wasn't just any old crop, it was the cornerstone of the Maya diet and economy. We're talking about fields of corn, beans, and squash, the infamous three sisters of agriculture, planted in a symbiotic system that maximized yield and minimized soil depletion. This ingenious method of farming allowed the Maya to support large urban centers like Tikal and Kapan, with populations reaching into the tens of thousands. But here's where we dispel another myth. The life of a Maya farmer was no pastoral idyll. These folks weren't frolicking through sunlit fields with a song in their hearts. Farming was backbreaking work, from dawn till dusk, with the threat of drought, pests, and the ever-present demands from the ruling class looming over their heads. Imagine trying to balance an Excel sheet while a boss hovers, expecting miracles on a shoestring budget, and you've got a glimpse into their world. Let's talk numbers. A single maize planting could yield enough to feed a family for a year, but that was contingent on a good harvest. Failures could mean famine, and the stakes were high. Farmers had to plan meticulously, with an eye on both the skies and the soil, to ensure their communities thrived. And while we're busting myths, let's address the misconception of the noble savage, the idea that Maya farmers lived in harmony with nature. In reality, the relationship was anything but idyllic. The Maya practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, a method that, while effective in the short term, led to deforestation and soil degradation over time. It's a stark reminder that even advanced civilizations had their environmental missteps. Despite these challenges, the contributions of farmers were indispensable. Their role in sustaining the Maya civilization was so vital that they were often central figures in the Popol Vuh, illustrating their importance not just in the economy, but in the spiritual fabric of Maya life. Yet, for all their hard work, farmers and artisans remained at the lower rungs of the social ladder. The Maya class structure was rigid, and upward mobility was as rare as a solar eclipse. The fruits of their labor enriched the elite, while they toiled away in relative obscurity. Think of it as the ancient version of the gig economy, essential workers with little recognition or reward. But let's not leave it on a bleak note. Despite the challenges, there was a profound resilience among the Maya commoners. Their ability to adapt, innovate, and endure in the face of adversity is a testament to their ingenuity and tenacity. And while the grand monuments and celestial calendars often steal the spotlight, the true legacy of the Maya lies in the hands of those who built, farmed, and crafted without fanfare. As we continue to unravel the layers of Maya society, it's clear that artisans and farmers were not just cogs in a cosmic machine, but vital players in a civilization that thrived for centuries. Their stories, often overshadowed by the grand narratives of kings and priests, remind us that history is not just written by the victors, but by those who toil in the shadows, whose contributions lay the foundation for greatness. So, as we prepare to dive into the final chapters of the Maya saga, let's carry with us the echoes of their hard-won legacy, one of endurance, creativity, and the unyielding spirit of a people who dared to carve their mark on history. As we journey into the twilight of the Maya civilization, it's time to face the music, or perhaps the eerie silence that followed their decline. The Maya, those brilliant architects of pyramids, calendars, and societies, faced a downfall that was less of a sudden apocalypse and more of a slow, grinding unraveling. But before we get carried away with visions of mysterious disappearances a la Atlantis, let's dig into the nitty-gritty of what really happened. First off, let's debunk the idea of a dramatic vanishing act. The Maya didn't just pack up their pyramids and vanish into the mist. No, their decline was more akin to a prolonged fade-out, like the last season of your once-favorite TV show that somehow lost its spark. By the 9th century, many of the bustling city-states in the southern lowlands were abandoned, their grand plazas and towering temples left to the jungle. But why? Well, the answer is as complex as the society itself. Imagine a perfect storm of economic pressures, social turmoil, and environmental shifts, all swirling together to create a crisis that even the most cunning Ajor couldn't navigate. Start with the environmental factors. The Maya lived in a region that depended heavily on rain-fed agriculture. With no handy irrigation systems to fall back on, they were at the mercy of the weather gods. And spoiler alert, the gods were not always benevolent. Evidence suggests a series of severe droughts hit during the terminal classic period, roughly 800–950 AD, drying up water sources and turning fertile fields into parched dust bowls. But water wasn't the only thing in short supply. As populations ballooned, imagine 19 million people spread across Mesoamerica. The demand for resources skyrocketed. Farming practices like slash and burn, while ingenious in their time, couldn't keep pace with the growing need. Soil degradation became a real issue, and the land could only yield so much before it tapped out, leaving the Maya with a serious case of agricultural burnout. Now, economic pressures weren't just limited to the fields. The tribute system, where commoners provided labor and goods to the elite, was stretched to breaking point. With resources dwindling, the burden on the lower classes increased, leading to social tensions. When you're working your fingers to the bone, just to watch the fruits of your labor disappear into the coffers of the elite, dissatisfaction isn't just likely, it's inevitable. This economic imbalance was like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right moment to explode. And explode it did, in the form of internal strife and warfare. The Maya city-states, once linked by trade and diplomacy, turned on each other in a desperate scramble for resources and power. The inscriptions tell tales of battles fought, alliances broken, and cities laid to waste. It was a Game of Thrones sans the dragons, but with all the political intrigue and betrayal you could ask for. Yet, despite these internal conflicts, the Maya were also facing external pressures. As the northern city-states began to rise, places like Chichen Itzar and Uxmal, they drew power away from the south, exacerbating the decline of the once mighty southern centers. This shift wasn't just about geography, it was a fundamental change in the balance of power, akin to New York losing its status as a global financial hub to, say, Des Moines. So, where does this leave the romantic notion of a mysterious Maya downfall? Well, it's time to put that myth to bed. The reality is far more grounded, and dare I say, more intriguing. It's a narrative of a civilization grappling with challenges both self-inflicted and beyond their control. The Maya didn't disappear, they adapted. Many migrated to more sustainable regions, and their descendants are still here today, living in parts of Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras, preserving their rich cultural heritage. As we sift through the ruins of this once great civilization, what lessons can we glean? For starters, the Maya remind us that no society is invincible. Environmental stewardship is crucial, as is maintaining a balanced economy that doesn't overburden the very people who sustain it. When resources are mismanaged and social inequalities ignored, Even the mightiest can fall. Moreover, the Maya story underscores the importance of adaptability. While some city-states crumbled, others thrived by embracing change. Chichen Itza, for example, reinvented itself, integrating new cultural influences and thriving long after other centers had declined. It's a testament to the resilience of societies that are willing to evolve in the face of adversity. In modern times, as we face our own challenges, from climate change to economic inequality, the Maya offer a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope. We can learn from their mistakes and their triumphs, understanding that while our technologies and economies may differ, the fundamental dynamics of power, resource management, and human resilience remain constant. So, as you drift off to sleep with these ancient echoes in your mind, remember that history is not just a record of the past, but a guide for the present. The Maya, with all their grandeur and flaws, remind us that the future is not set in stone, but is shaped by the choices we make today. And perhaps, like the Maya, we can carve a legacy that endures, not just in monuments and myths, but in the lessons we pass on to generations yet to come. In the spring of 1494, in what is now the city of Trabzon on the northeastern coast of Turkey, a future powerhouse was born. This wasn't just any local kid who'd grow up to be a successful goat herder or fisherman. No, this was Suleiman, the man who'd eventually earn the nickname, the Magnificent. It's a bold title, but we'll get to why he earned it. For now, let's dip into the cradle of the Ottoman Empire and see what made young Suleiman tick. Growing up in the Ottoman heart house wasn't exactly like attending your neighborhood middle school. We're talking royal tutors, a multicultural court, and a hefty dose of political intrigue served with breakfast. Suleiman's father, Selim, wasn't exactly the kind of guy to hand out participation trophies. Known as Selim the Grim, he had a reputation for being about as warm and cuddly as a porcupine. Selim was the sultan who expanded the empire into the Middle East, and he expected no less from his son. Here, the expectations weren't just about being a good ruler, but about being a ruler who could balance a sword on one hand and a book of poetry in the other. Yes, Suleiman was a Renaissance man before the Renaissance was cool, despite the harsh realities of royal life, where siblings were often seen as competition to be eliminated. Suleiman developed a surprising taste for the arts. His poetry, infused with Sufi mysticism, wasn't just a hobby, it was a tool for governance. Imagine a ruler who could just as easily decimate his enemies on the battlefield as he could compose a verse about the fleeting nature of power. That's Suleiman in a nutshell, a man who understood both the allure of power and its transient nature. While Suleiman was busy being the empire's resident bard, the political landscape around him was anything but poetic. The Ottoman Empire in the early 16th century was a sprawling entity that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. But with great expanse came great complications. The empire was a patchwork quilt of cultures, religions, and languages, each with its own little quirks and qualms. Managing such diversity required more than just brute force. It required diplomacy and an understanding of the human condition, skills that young Suleiman honed alongside his military training. Now, let's talk about education. This wasn't your standard curriculum with algebra and biology. Suleiman was schooled in the classics, but his lessons went beyond the typical royal fare. He learned the intricacies of Islamic law, the art of administration, and the delicate dance of international diplomacy. His tutors were the intellectual heavyweights of the day, and they drilled into him the importance of being a just and wise ruler. This was a time when rulers were expected to be both warriors and scholars. Suleiman took that expectation and ran with it, proving that intellect and power could coexist in the same throne room. But what about the mythic stories of Suleiman's early life? Well, while it's tempting to imagine him practicing swordplay in a moonlit garden or penning love sonnets to an unseen muse, the reality was likely more grounded. The Ottoman court was a hotbed of political maneuvering, where alliances were as fragile as glass. Suleiman would have grown up acutely aware of the stakes, knowing that his future wasn't just about personal glory, but about the survival and prosperity of an empire that was as volatile as it was vast. Suleiman's rise to power wasn't a fairy tale, nor was it a straightforward ascent. His path was paved with the complexities of inheritance and expectation, shaped by the ambitions of a father whose shadow loomed large. Yet, he managed to carve out an identity that was distinctively his own, a leader who embraced both the sword and the pen, who understood that the might of an empire lay not just in its conquests, but in the legacy it left behind. As we continue to unravel the tapestry of Suleiman's life, keep in mind that this was a man who defied the era's norms. He was a poet-warrior, a strategist with the soul of an artist, and a ruler whose legacy would earn him a spot in the annals of history. The Ottoman Empire was his stage, and trust me, he knew how to work the crowd. So, buckle up as we delve deeper into the life and times of one of history's most intriguing figures, exploring how this young poet prince transformed into a sultan whose magnificence still echoes through the ages. And so, our tale of Suleiman continues, shifting from the poetic halls of his youth to the dusty, blood-soaked fields of his military campaigns. By the time 1521 rolled around, Suleiman wasn't just flexing his muscles. He was rebranding the Ottoman Empire as a veritable powerhouse. Cue the capture of Belgrade, the linchpin of the Danube, a fortress so strategically vital it was practically a medieval GPS system. Now, let's not kid ourselves with tales of Suleiman single-handedly storming the gates while reciting poetry. The siege of Belgrade was more logistics than legend. Picture this: 300 ships and a staggering 100,000 soldiers marching across Europe like a mobile city. The Ottomans didn't just bring their swords, they packed the medieval equivalent of a buffet. We're talking about supply chains that would make Amazon jealous. This wasn't just about brute force, it was about coordination, timing, and dare I say, a smidge of diplomacy. Suleiman didn't just conquer, he negotiated the very paths of his armies through lands that could have easily turned hostile. Economically, the siege was a monster. Mobilizing such a force meant draining the empire's coffers, a gamble that could have bankrupted lesser rulers. But Suleiman knew the payout. Control of the Danube meant control of a vital trade route. The city fell in August 1521, not with a dramatic final charge, but with a calculated siege that wore down the defenders until they were waving the white flag. Romantic? Hardly. Effective? Absolutely. Next, we move to the Siege of Rhodes in 1522, where Suleiman's strategies shone like a well-polished scimitar. The Knights Hospitaller, those medieval rock stars of chivalry, had held Rhodes since the Crusades. They were the kind of enemy that inspired epic tales, their fortress seemingly impregnable, their knights as legendary as the tales of Arthur. But Suleiman wasn't dressing up as a knight in shining armor. He brought cannons. This siege was a masterclass in persistence. For 6 months, Ottoman forces, numbering around 100,000 once again, battered the walls of Rhodes. The knights, all 7,000 of them, held fast with a mix of grit and sheer stubbornness. Yet for all their valor, they faced an enemy who approached war with the cool detachment of a chess grandmaster. Suleiman's forces cut off supplies, bombarded defenses, and slowly tightened their grip, like a python with a PhD in patience. The economic cost: staggering. The siege drained the Ottoman treasury, but just like Belgrade, the return on investment was too sweet to ignore. Taking Rhodes meant controlling the eastern Mediterranean, a maritime jackpot that could fund future campaigns. By December, the knights, depleted and outnumbered, negotiated a surrender that, surprisingly, allowed them safe passage off the island. Suleiman, for all his military might, knew when to play the role of the benevolent victor. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The image of Suleiman as a military genius who effortlessly conquered lands is as enticing as it is inaccurate. The reality was a mix of meticulous planning, overwhelming force, and let's be honest, a bit of luck. Wars weren't won by grand speeches and valor alone. They were won by the side that could outlast, outthink, and outspend the other. Suleiman understood this all too well, and his campaigns were as much about financial strategy as they were about battlefield tactics. Yet, there's a romantic allure to these tales, isn't there? The idea of a sultan sweeping across Europe and the Mediterranean, shaping the world with his ambition and charisma. It's a story that sells, one that echoes through the corridors of history like a particularly catchy pop tune. But remember, behind every legend is a ledger, and Suleiman's conquests were as much about maintaining balance sheets as they were about expanding horizons. So, as we close this chapter on Suleiman's early military exploits, remember, The real drama wasn't just in the battles, but in the painstaking details of empire building. The logistics, the politics, the sheer audacity of his vision. These were the tools that crafted his legacy. And while the tales of his conquests might sparkle with romantic flair, the reality is a testament to the complex, often grueling, art of leadership. Stay tuned, because the saga of Suleiman the Magnificent is far from over, and there's plenty more intrigue, strategy, and yes, a bit of poetry on the horizon. Now, as we shift gears from the battlefield to the more cerebral arenas of lore and culture, it's time to explore how Suleiman earned his magnificent moniker without swinging a sword. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just because he had a flair for architecture or a knack for writing catchy couplets. First up on our tour of Suleiman's domestic agenda is the canon, a legal system that was as groundbreaking as it was necessary. Picture the Ottoman Empire at its zenith, a vast expanse of territories, each with its own legal quirks, like a 16th-century jigsaw puzzle with pieces from different boxes. The existing Sharia laws were robust, but didn't cover everything. Think of them like a Swiss Army knife, missing a few tools. Enter the canon, Suleiman's masterstroke in governance, filling in the gaps with secular laws that addressed everything from taxes to criminal justice. This wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was about streamlining an empire that stretched from the Balkans to the sands of Arabia. And here's the kicker. Suleiman's legal reforms were so effective that they continued to influence Ottoman governance long after he was gone. Talk about a legacy. But let's not pretend Suleiman was some kind of ancient legal wonderkind working alone in a dimly lit library. The creation of the canon was a team effort, an ensemble cast of scholars, legal experts, and bureaucrats who could probably recite law codes in their sleep. The beauty of the canon was its flexibility. It allowed local customs to coexist with imperial law, a balancing act that kept the peace without compromising the empire's integrity. It's like Suleiman had a foot in both worlds, traditional and modern, before it was cool. Now, legal systems aren't exactly the stuff of legends, unless you're a legal historian with a flair for drama. So, let's sprinkle in a bit of romance with Suleiman's patronage of the arts. This wasn't just a sultan who appreciated good calligraphy. This was a ruler who saw art as an extension of his empire's power. He wasn't just building mosques, he was crafting legacies in stone and tile. Cue the Suleimani Mosque, an architectural marvel that looms over Istanbul like a grandiose symbol of Ottoman majesty. Designed by Mimar Sinan, the empire's answer to Leonardo da Vinci, this mosque wasn't just a place of worship, it was a statement of imperial ambition. With its soaring domes and intricate minarets, it shouted, "We're here, and we're magnificent," to anyone passing through the Bosphorus. If you think the Suleimani Mosque was just for show, think again. It was part of a larger complex that included a hospital, schools, and a soup kitchen. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about community welfare and showing the empire's softer side. Investing in such projects, Suleiman was doing more than just cementing his legacy. He was ensuring that his people were taken care of in a way that would echo through the centuries. And then there's Topkapi Palace, the beating heart of the Ottoman court. Picture a labyrinth of opulent rooms and lush gardens, a place where politics and pleasure mingled in equal measure. Topkapi was the stage for the empire's most intricate dramas, where alliances were forged, betrayals plotted, and peacocks strutted around like they owned the place. It was here that Suleiman held court, surrounded by viziers, scribes, and the occasional poet. The palace wasn't just a backdrop. It was a living, breathing entity, a microcosm of the empire itself. Now, let's debunk a few myths. The image of Suleiman lounging in a harem, surrounded by silk-clad concubines and sipping sherbet, is tempting but misleading. While the harem was indeed a part of the palace, it was more complex than the Orientalist fantasies would have you believe. It was a political institution, a place where alliances were made, and future sultans were born. And let's not forget the women of the harem, who wielded influence behind the scenes, shaping the empire in subtle ways that often went unrecorded in the history books. Back to Suleiman's court, where the arts weren't just decorative but political. Patronage of poets, calligraphers, and musicians was a way to project power, to show that the Ottoman Empire was as much a cultural powerhouse as a military one. Poetry, in particular, was Suleiman's soft spot. Under the pen name Muhibi, He composed verses that blended Sufi mysticism with personal reflection. This wasn't just about art for art's sake. It was about crafting a narrative, showing that Suleiman was a ruler who understood the nuances of power and the complexities of the human soul. But let's reel it back to the nitty-gritty, the economic realities underpinning these grand projects. Building mosques and palaces wasn't cheap. It required a steady flow of resources, a robust treasury, and an economy that could support such ambitions. The empire's wealth, bolstered by trade routes and conquests, was the engine behind these monumental achievements. Suleiman understood that to maintain his empire's grandeur, he needed more than just military might. He needed economic stability and cultural cohesion. As we wrap up this segment, remember that Suleiman's reign wasn't just about conquests and courtly intrigue. It was about the art of governance, about marrying tradition with innovation, law with culture. His legacy wasn't just carved into the walls of mosques or penned in poetry. It was woven into the very fabric of the empire he ruled. The myths may dazzle, but the reality, complex, multifaceted, and often gritty, is where the true magnificence of his reign lies. Keep your curiosity piqued, because the saga of Suleiman is far from over. There are more layers to peel back, more stories to unravel in this epic of history. Now, let's pivot from Suleiman's grand architectural gestures and poetic musings to a different kind of stage, the international diplomatic theater. Picture Europe in the 16th century, a patchwork of rivalries and alliances that would make any modern political strategist break out in a cold sweat. It was in this tumultuous landscape that Suleiman the Magnificent flexed his diplomatic muscles, crafting alliances that were as surprising as they were strategic. First on our diplomatic roster is the Franco-Ottoman alliance, a union that might seem as unlikely as peanut butter and caviar, but was pure genius in geopolitical terms. By the 1520s, France and the Habsburgs were already entrenched in one of history's longest-running feuds, a Game of Thrones-style saga that would make even George R.R. Martin jealous. Enter Suleiman, who saw an opportunity to shake up the European chessboard by teaming up with Francis I of France. Their common enemy, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and the Habsburg heavyweight who seemed to have a finger in every European pie. The Franco-Ottoman alliance was officially sealed in 1536, but unofficially it had been simmering for a while. Suleiman and Francis were like two kids on the playground who realized they both hated the same bully. This alliance wasn't just a diplomatic footnote, it was a seismic shift. For the first time, a Muslim power had a formal alliance with a Christian nation, much to the chagrin of the rest of Europe. Diplomats must have spat out their morning coffee when they heard the news. But why would France, the bastion of Catholicism, team up with the Ottoman Empire? Simple, realpolitik, a term that hadn't been coined yet but was certainly practiced. By aligning with Suleiman, Francis I gained a powerful ally against the Habsburgs, while Suleiman got a foothold in European affairs without having to march his army across the continent. It was a marriage of convenience, orchestrated not by love, but by a shared disdain for Charles V's ever-growing empire. Let's add a dash of humor to this grand political drama. Imagine the cultural exchanges between the Ottoman and French courts. Picture French ambassadors in Istanbul trying valiantly to navigate the complexities of Ottoman protocol while probably sweating through their silk stockings in the summer heat. Meanwhile, Ottoman envoys in Paris might have marveled at the French obsession with elaborate wigs and the peculiar habit of bathing more in perfume than water. These exchanges, often peppered with misunderstandings and awkward faux pas, were the stuff of diplomatic legend. Now, let's shift gears and talk about Suleiman's dual identity as both a lawgiver and conqueror. The title lawgiver often gets overshadowed by his reputation as a military juggernaut, but it's crucial to understanding his legacy. Suleiman wasn't just about expanding borders, he was about consolidating them. His legal reforms, the canon, played a pivotal role in maintaining the empire's internal stability, ensuring that his conquests didn't crumble under the weight of their own success. But here's the rub. The image of Suleiman as a benevolent lawmaker can sometimes obscure the fact that he was also deeply invested in the art of warfare. His campaigns weren't just for glory. They were strategic moves designed to bolster the empire's economic and political standing. The truth is, Suleiman was both the pen and the sword, a ruler who understood that law and conquest were two sides of the same coin. And let's not forget the economic undertones of his reign. War wasn't just a game of strategy. It was an economic engine that fueled the empire's coffers. Every new territory meant new resources, new trade routes, and of course, new taxes. Suleiman's military ventures were as much about securing economic prosperity as they were about expanding his empire's prestige. After all, you couldn't fund grand masques and maintain vast armies on poetry alone. Now, while we're on the subject of myth-busting, let's address the romanticized image of Suleiman as a chivalrous conqueror. The reality was far more complex. His military campaigns were ruthless, calculated affairs, often involving sieges that dragged on for months and battles that were as brutal as they were decisive. The notion of Suleiman as a knight in shining armor, galloping across the plains to rescue damsels in distress, is as appealing as it is fictional. The real Suleiman was a master strategist who understood the harsh realities of power, both its allure and its costs. Yet, there's no denying the allure of these legends. The stories of Suleiman's military brilliance and diplomatic savvy have a certain cinematic quality, the kind that sticks in the imagination long after the facts have faded. It's a testament to the enduring power of narrative, the way history can be both a record and a romance, depending on who's telling the tale. As we draw this chapter to a close, let's remember that Suleiman's reign was a tapestry of contradictions. He was a ruler who crafted alliances as deftly as he waged war, who wrote laws as passionately as he penned poetry. His legacy is a testament to the complexities of leadership, a reminder that history is seldom black and white, but rather a canvas splashed with shades of ambition, power, and yes, a touch of magnificence. Stay tuned, because the saga of Suleiman the Magnificent is far from over, and there's plenty more intrigue, strategy, and perhaps a bit of poetry on the horizon. As the curtain falls on the grand theatre of Suleiman's reign, we find ourselves in the autumn of 1566 at the siege of Srivijaya. This wasn't just any clash of arms. It was a final act brimming with the pathos and pragmatism that defined Suleiman's life. Picture it, a 72-year-old sultan, commanding from behind a veil of illness, determined to press on, despite the whispers of mortality echoing through his tent. It's the kind of scene that makes you wonder if history was written by playwrights with a flair for the dramatic. Suleiman's death during the siege was as much a strategic maneuver as it was a tragic denouement. He died on September 6, 1566, before the fortress fell, but his passing was kept secret until victory was assured. Talk about commitment to the cause. This was a leader so determined to maintain morale that even his death had to wait for the right moment. The siege itself was a brutal affair, costing the Ottomans tens of thousands of soldiers, but Srivijaya's fall marked an important, if Pyrrhic, victory. It was the last in a series of conquests that, while impressive, also highlighted the empire's overreach, straining its resources and stretching its armies thin. With Suleiman's death, the empire stood at a crossroads. His son, Selim Roman II, inherited a sprawling realm that was as much a patchwork of treaties and conquests as it was a coherent empire. Selim, dubbed Selim the Sart, for his less-than-stellar reputation. Think of your college roommate who always had a drink in hand, lacked his father's vision and vigor. Under his rule, the empire shifted from expansion to consolidation, a pivot that spoke volumes about the challenges left in Suleiman's wake. The empire's vast territories became harder to manage, and without Suleiman's steady hand, cracks began to appear in the Ottoman facade. But here's the kicker. While Suleiman's military campaigns and legal reforms were monumental, his real legacy was the idea of balance. He was the embodiment of a ruler who understood that power wasn't just about conquest. It was about administration and culture, about leaving something behind that would outlast the clang of swords and the dust of battle. His canon reforms were a testament to this, creating a legal framework that helped keep the empire together long after his death. They were the glue that bound together a diverse empire, a reminder that governance was as much about stitching as it was about striking. And then there's the mythic allure, Suleiman the Magnificent, a title that sounds like it was ripped from the pages of a medieval bestseller, remains a figure cloaked in romance. The legends of his reign, from his poetic prowess to his military might, continue to captivate. Yet, Beneath the gilded veneer lies the reality of a ruler who navigated the treacherous waters of politics and power with a deftness that was anything but mythical. He was a man who knew that the true test of leadership wasn't just in the victories won, but in the legacy left behind. The economic context of his reign cannot be overstated. Suleiman's empire was a behemoth, its wealth drawn from vast territories and bustling trade routes. The economy was both his greatest asset and his Achilles heel. While the riches of the empire funded his grand projects and military campaigns, they also created an insatiable need for more land, more resources, more control. The push and pull of expansion and consolidation were the rhythms of his reign, a dance that required both grace and grit. As we reflect on Suleiman's legacy, it's clear that his story is one of contrasts. He was a poet-warrior, a conqueror-lawgiver, a ruler whose reign was as much about crafting narratives as it was about crafting laws. His life was a testament to the complexities of leadership, a reminder that the stories we tell about history are as much about the shadows as they are about the light. The myths that survived him, while alluring, are only part of the tapestry. The real story is woven with threads of ambition, calculation, and an understanding of empire that was as profound as it was pragmatic. In the grand scheme of history, Suleiman remains a towering figure, not just because of the lands he conquered or the laws he wrote, but because of the enduring impact of his vision. He was a sultan who understood that true magnificence lay not in the fleeting glory of conquest, but in the enduring legacy of governance. His reign was an epic blend of romance and reality, a saga that continues to inspire and intrigue, reminding us that the past is not just a record of what was, but a lens through which we can understand the complex dance of power and legacy. In 1304, a baby was born in Tanya, Morocco, and let's be honest, nobody expected him to become the Forrest Gump of the medieval world. Meet Ibn Battuta, a man whose travel itinerary would give even Google Maps a nervous breakdown. 2 decades later, at the tender age of 21, Ibn Battuta decided he'd rather face the treacherous sand dunes of the Sahara than another family dinner. So, he set off on what was supposed to be a straightforward pilgrimage to Mecca in 1325. Spoiler alert, it was anything but straightforward. Now remember, this was the 14th century. There were no direct flights, no TripAdvisor reviews, and certainly no GPS. Just a young man, a trusty camel, and an unreasonable amount of wanderlust. His first stop was Egypt, a land of pyramids, pharaohs, and as it turns out, fair number of bandits. You see, the Nile was like the medieval version of the Autobahn. Everyone wanted a piece of the action, including those with less than honest intentions. But Ibn Battuta, with the optimism only a 21-year-old could muster, ploughed ahead, dodging danger and questionable lodging along the way. Ibn Battuta had this uncanny knack for getting sidetracked, which is a bit like saying the Titanic had a minor issue with icebergs. Take his journey through Egypt. For example, instead of heading straight to Mecca, he decided to take the scenic route through the cultural hotbeds of Cairo and Alexandria. And why not? Cairo was the Paris of the medieval world, bustling with scholars, traders, and the kind of street food that might just make you forget about the risk of dysentery. But let's not gloss over the perilous parts. Medieval travel was not for the faint-hearted. Picture rickety boats, relentless heat, and inns that might generously be described as rustic. Ibn Battuta's journey through Egypt was like an episode of Survivor, without the $1 million prize at the end. Bandits roamed the roads, and accommodations often lacked, well, walls. Yet, our intrepid traveler pressed on, perhaps driven by a mix of spiritual devotion and a healthy dose of curiosity. After traversing Egypt and Syria, facing everything from the oppressive heat to overly curious locals, Ibn Battuta finally made it to Mecca. It took him over a year to cover the roughly 3,000 miles from Tanya, a journey filled with enough detours to make even the most seasoned road tripper weep. But for Ibn Battuta, the journey was as important as the destination. He wasn't just collecting passport stamps, he was amassing experiences, stories, and the occasional battle scar. And here's the thing. Ibn Battuta's tendency to wander off the beaten path wasn't just a quirk, it was a survival strategy. In a world where maps were vague at best, and roads were often more concept than reality, adaptability was key. He learned to navigate not just the physical terrain, but also the social landscapes of the regions he visited. Speaking of which, let's debunk a little myth here. While it's tempting to romanticize the medieval traveler as a lone adventurer, the truth is that Ibn Battuta often relied on local guides and the kindness of strangers to make his way. So there you have it. The early life of Ibn Battuta, a man whose idea of a vacation was a perilous trek across continents. What started as a simple pilgrimage turned into a lifelong odyssey, with our young Moroccan exploring far beyond the bounds of the Islamic world. Let's just say that for Ibn Battuta, life was less about the destination and more about the stories he could tell over dinner. And trust me, those stories were just getting started. And so, Ibn Battuta's pilgrimage to Mecca turned into a lifelong adventure, like that friend who goes out for milk and comes back years later with a full beard and tales of far-off lands. Post-Mecca, he set his sights on the Middle East and India, with a pit stop in Iraq to meet local scholars. Baghdad was the intellectual hotspot of the time, a medieval Silicon Valley minus the tech bros, where philosophers debated everything from the Quran to whether the earth was round. Spoiler, a few of them were ahead of their time. Ibn Battuta's journey through the Middle East was a masterclass in cultural immersion, with him soaking up the sights and sounds of Persia and beyond. He was like a medieval Anthony Bourdain, sampling local delicacies and occasionally regretting it. In Persia, he encountered Zoroastrian fire temples, which he found both fascinating and a little too warm for comfort. But Persian hospitality generally agreed with him, especially the part where he didn't have to pay for lodging, thanks to the region's tradition of hosting travelers. Ibn Battuta quickly learned that when you're a guest in these parts, you better eat up, even if the dish is unidentifiable and possibly still moving. Then there was India, the land of spices, riches, and a ruler who had a penchant for unpredictability. Enter Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq of Delhi, a ruler whose governing style might be politely described as eccentric. This guy had more schemes than a late-night infomercial. He once tried to move his entire capital 700 miles south on a whim, a decision about as practical as trying to relocate a mountain. But for Ibn Battuta, this was an opportunity. The Sultan appointed him as a cadi, or judge, in his court, a role that was both prestigious and precarious. Being a judge under Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq was like being the sober friend at a frat party, a lot of responsibility and no guarantee anyone would listen. The Sultan's whims could turn on a dime, and his temper was legendary. But Ibn Battuta, ever the diplomat, managed to navigate the court's treacherous waters. He settled disputes, often involving parties who'd rather duel than talk, and tried to keep the peace in a land where peace was as elusive as a mirage in the desert. This period also highlighted the economic realities of medieval travel. Ibn Battuta often relied on the Sultan's generosity, as coinage was not just hard to come by, it was downright elusive. Being a traveling scholar had its perks, but a steady paycheck wasn't one of them. His survival depended on the goodwill of rulers and the occasional lavish gift, a gold coin here, a fancy robe there. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Sultan's court was rife with intrigue, and misunderstandings were as common as monsoons in Mumbai. Ibn Battuta's attempts to fit in sometimes led to comic missteps, like wearing the wrong turban at the wrong time or mispronouncing a local dignitary's name, resulting in awkward silences and the odd raised eyebrow. Despite the challenges, Ibn Battuta's time in India was rich in experiences. He witnessed local customs that were as baffling as they were fascinating. Take, for example, the practice of sati, where widows were expected to join their deceased husbands on the funeral pyre. To a man from a culture where such practices were unthinkable, this was a chilling reminder of the cultural chasms that separated him from his hosts. Yet, he took it all in stride, documenting these practices with a mix of awe and horror, never quite shedding his outsider's perspective, but always striving to understand. The Sultan's court was a melting pot of cultures, with visitors from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ibn Battuta met scholars from China, traders from Africa, and mystics from Persia, each adding a new thread to the rich tapestry of his travels. And while he often found himself bewildered by local customs, he also reveled in the diversity of human experience, a diversity that was both the bane and boon of his wanderlust. But let's debunk a little myth here. Ibn Battuta wasn't just a wide-eyed wanderer. He was a shrewd observer of human nature. He understood that power dynamics were as important as geography in shaping history. The Sultan's court was a case study in political maneuvering, where alliances shifted as easily as sand dunes in a storm. Ibn Battuta's survival depended not just on his ability to navigate physical landscapes, but also on his skill in reading people and situations. And so, as Ibn Battuta continued his journey through India and beyond, he left behind a trail of stories as colorful and complex as the lands he traversed. His travels were a testament to the indomitable human spirit, a reminder that curiosity and courage can take you places you never imagined. But his story doesn't end here. There are more adventures on the horizon, more lands to explore, and more myths to unravel. Stay tuned, because the journey is far from over. Since Ibn Battuta's passport was more of a concept than a reality, he was never going to stop at India. No, our intrepid traveler had more stamps to collect, and his next chapters took him through the vibrant markets and lush landscapes of Southeast Asia, eventually leading him to the enigmatic lands of China. Now, if his adventures in India were like a roller coaster built by a particularly ambitious toddler, his Southeast Asian escapade was a whole new ride, complete with unexpected twists, vibrant cultures, and the occasional myth worth debunking. Southeast Asia, in the 14th century, was a smorgasbord of kingdoms and cultures, each with its own flavor of chaos and intrigue. Ibn Battuta sailed through the Straits of Malacca, the medieval version of a high-traffic freeway, where pirates were as common as traffic jams and just as unpleasant. But let's be real, Ibn Battuta wasn't about to let a few potential kidnappings ruin his vibe. He was on a mission to see the world, or at least as much of it as he could without losing his head. When Battuta arrived in what is now modern-day Indonesia, he found a society that was as vibrant as it was volatile. The kingdom of Samudra Pasai, for example, was a bustling trade hub where spices were the currency of the realm and the aroma of cloves filled the air. The economic engine of the region was fueled by the spice trade, with black pepper and nutmeg being worth their weight in gold. Ibn Battuta's tales from the area read like a travel blog that balances the allure of exotic locales with the ominous undercurrent of potential peril. Think, eat, pray, love, but with a significant risk of malaria. Our wanderer also encountered the Majapahit Empire in Java, a formidable power in the region. The Majapahit rulers were adept at diplomacy, and Ibn Battuta quickly learned that navigating the local political waters was a bit like playing chess with a board full of missing pieces. His knack for forming strategic alliances was put to the test as he engaged with local sultans and merchant leaders, weaving through a tapestry of power dynamics that could change with the tides. But perhaps the most intriguing part of Ibn Battuta's Southeast Asian leg was his visit to the lands of what is today Vietnam. Here, he observed a society that was as hierarchical as it was harmonious. The Vietnamese rulers were masters of striking a balance between traditional Confucian values and the pragmatic demands of trade and warfare. Ibn Battuta was fascinated by their ability to maintain order in a world that seemed to thrive on chaos. He was like a medieval anthropologist, documenting customs and governance with the eye of someone who knew that understanding was a currency just as valuable as gold. Next on the itinerary, China. Now, if you've heard that Ibn Battuta's tales of China were a bit exaggerated, you're not alone. Think of his accounts as the medieval version of a viral travel blog, equal parts fact and fiction, with a sprinkle of embellishment for good measure. Take his description of the Great Wall, which he claimed to have seen. Spoiler alert, he probably didn't. The Great Wall, as we think of it today, was a Ming Dynasty project, completed long after Ibn Battuta's time. But hey, why let a little thing like historical accuracy get in the way of a good story, right? In reality, Ibn Battuta's journey through China was more about the bustling cities and elaborate bureaucracies of the Yuan dynasty. This was the era of Kublai Khan's descendants, who managed to build a society where paper money was already a thing, centuries before it caught on in Europe. Ibn Battuta was like a financial reporter in a land of economic innovations, taking mental notes on how the Chinese managed to create wealth from thin air. The Yuan dynasty's use of paper currency was revolutionary, and while Ibn Battuta marveled at this, he also understood the precarious nature of such an economy, where inflation lurked like a hungry dragon. His observations weren't limited to currency, though. He was equally fascinated by the maritime prowess of the Chinese, whose junks dominated the seas like floating fortresses. The Chinese ships were technological marvels, with multiple masts and watertight compartments that made them the dreadnoughts of their day. Ibn Battuta's own seafaring experiences paled in comparison, and he documented these vessels with an awe that was only slightly tinged by envy. But let's not forget the political landscape. Ibn Battuta's ability to make friends in high places served him well in China. He rubbed shoulders with local officials and scholars, navigating the labyrinth of Chinese bureaucracy with the same ease that he navigated the physical terrain. The Yuan dynasty was a melting pot of Mongol and Chinese influences, and Ibn Battuta deftly danced between these cultural currents, leveraging his charm and intellect to secure safe passage and accommodation. His interactions with Chinese scholars were particularly enlightening, offering him insights into Confucian philosophy and the complexities of Chinese governance, an experience that expanded his worldview and enriched his understanding of human society. Through his travels in Southeast Asia and China, Ibn Battuta not only collected stories, but also broadened his understanding of the world. His journals are a testament to the diversity of human experience, a reminder that while cultures may differ, the core of humanity remains the same. His tales, though occasionally stretched for dramatic effect, offer a window into a world that was as vast and varied as it was interconnected, and while his accounts might sometimes read like the fever dreams of a particularly imaginative storyteller, they capture the essence of an explorer who was driven by an insatiable curiosity and a desire to understand the tapestry of life beyond his own borders. So, as Ibn Battuta continued his journey, leaving behind the lands of Southeast Asia and China, he carried with him a wealth of experiences and a deeper understanding of the world. But his story doesn't end here. There are more adventures on the horizon, more lands to explore, and more myths to unravel. Stay tuned, because the journey is far from over. As Ibn Battuta left behind the vibrant chaos of Southeast Asia and the intrigue of China, his insatiable curiosity pulled him toward the treasures of sub-Saharan Africa. Picture him, a medieval Marco Polo with a Moroccan twist, setting his sights on the lands beyond the Sahara. The year was 1352, and while Europe was busy inventing the Renaissance, Ibn Battuta was about to unveil the wonders of the African continent, one sandy footstep at a time. Now, let's set the record straight. The Sahara wasn't exactly a friendly neighborhood to wander into. It stretched over 6 million square miles, a veritable ocean of sand with fewer rest stops than a road trip through the Australian outback. But Ibn Battuta was nothing if not persistent. He joined a caravan, the medieval equivalent of a travel group, complete with camels as the only available mode of transport. Think of it as a very slow, very bumpy Uber pool. His journey into the heart of Africa led him to Mali, a kingdom as rich in gold as it was in culture. Now, if you've heard that Mali was the medieval El Dorado, you've got the right idea. Gold was practically falling out of the sky, or at least that's how the tales go. Mansa Musa, the ruler of Mali, was famously wealthy, so wealthy, in fact, that when he made a pilgrimage to Mecca, he reportedly distributed so much gold that he single-handedly crashed the gold market in Cairo. Talk about making a golden impression. But let's not get carried away by the glittering tales. Ibn Battuta's accounts of Mali provide a more nuanced picture. Sure, the kingdom was prosperous, but it wasn't all gold and glory. The trade routes were the real lifeblood of Mali, with caravans trudging across the Sahara loaded with gold, salt, and slaves. These routes were economic veins connecting Mali to North Africa and beyond, a medieval global supply chain with more sandstorms than spreadsheets. When Ibn Battuta arrived in Mali, he was struck by the blend of wealth and simplicity. The royal court was adorned with gold, yet the people lived in modest homes. It was a society where wealth was visible yet elusive, a paradox that Ibn Battuta found both fascinating and perplexing. He noted the importance of hospitality in Malian culture, where guests were treated with the kind of warmth that could melt even the iciest Saharan night. This wasn't just a social nicety. It was a survival strategy in a land where isolation could be as deadly as a scorpion's sting. But let's debunk a little myth here. While Ibn Battuta was impressed by Mali's riches, he also noted the kingdom's challenges. The roads, or what passed for them, were more like suggestions, and the distances between settlements were vast, making travel a test of endurance and patience. The climate was unforgiving, with temperatures that made a sauna feel like a cool breeze. Ibn Battuta's observations highlight the stark reality that beneath the romantic veneer of an African empire lay the harsh conditions that shaped it. One of the most intriguing aspects of Ibn Battuta's time in Mali was his interaction with local customs and governance. The Malian system was a blend of Islamic law and indigenous practices, a cultural fusion that Ibn Battuta found both familiar and foreign. He observed the griots, the storytellers and historians who preserved the kingdom's oral traditions. These were the original podcasters, spinning tales of heroes and history with a flair that would put Shakespeare to shame. Ibn Battuta's travels also brought him face to face with the realities of the African slave trade. While the romanticized image of Mali often focuses on its wealth, the kingdom's economy was also deeply intertwined with the grim practice of slavery. Slaves were a commodity, traded alongside gold and salt, and Ibn Battuta's writings provide a window into this darker side of medieval trade. It's a sobering reminder that beneath the allure of gold lay the human cost of empire building. As he ventured further into the African continent, Ibn Battuta encountered a tapestry of cultures as diverse as the landscapes themselves. From the bustling markets of Timbuktu, where books were as valuable as gold, to the lush forests of the Niger River, where nature reigned supreme, his journey was a kaleidoscope of experiences. He documented these encounters with the eye of an ethnographer and the pen of a poet, capturing the vibrancy of African societies in a way that few had before. Yet, documenting such vast distances was no small feat. Ibn Battuta's accounts are a testament to the practical challenges of medieval travel writing. No Google Docs, no backup cloud storage, just parchment and ink. His writings offer a fascinating glimpse into the logistical hurdles faced by medieval travelers. Distances were measured in days, not miles, and memory was as crucial as any map. Ibn Battuta had to rely on the reliability of oral accounts and his own recollections, a process that occasionally blurred the line between fact and embellishment. So, as Ibn Battuta's African chapter unfolded, he continued to unravel the complexities of a continent that was both familiar and foreign. His journey through sub-Saharan Africa was a mosaic of cultures and challenges, each piece adding depth to his understanding of the world. And while his tales were often tinged with the romance of discovery, they also revealed the stark realities that lay beneath the surface. As he prepared to leave Africa, Ibn Battuta carried with him a wealth of stories and an even greater appreciation for the diversity of human experience. But don't go thinking his story ends here. There are still more lands to explore, more cultures to encounter, and more adventures to be had. The journey is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be just as captivating. As Ibn Battuta prepared to bid farewell to the African continent, he was like a walking library, his mind brimming with stories that spanned deserts, kingdoms, and cultures. But every epic journey needs a return, and Ibn Battuta's homecoming was no less remarkable than his travels. After a staggering 29 years of wandering, he finally set foot back in Morocco in 1354. To put that in perspective, that's nearly 3 decades of globe-trotting before frequent flyer miles were a thing. Upon returning to Tanya, Ibn Battuta found himself a changed man in a changed land. The Morocco he left behind had evolved, just as he had. His family, expecting him to pop in for a quick chat over mint tea, was likely baffled by his tales of Mali's gold-laden streets and China's paper money. But this wasn't just a family reunion with exotic anecdotes. It was the beginning of a literary endeavor that would immortalize his adventures. Enter the Sultan of Morocco, Abu Inan Faris, who, upon hearing of Ibn Battuta's extensive travels, decided these tales deserved more than just the occasional dinner party retelling. He commissioned Ibn Juzay, a scholar and writer, to pen Ibn Battuta's memoirs, which would become the famed Rihla, meaning the journey. It's like the medieval version of a travel vlog, but instead of a camera, there was parchment and ink. The Rihla wasn't just a dry account of dates and distances. It was a tapestry of encounters and experiences, weaving together the diverse cultures Ibn Battuta had encountered. But let's be honest, like any good storyteller, he couldn't resist spicing things up a bit. Sometimes, his accounts read like the medieval equivalent of a tall tale, with a dash of hyperbole thrown in for flavor. Did he really see the Great Wall of China? Probably not. But hey, why let facts get in the way of a good yarn? Despite the embellishments, Ibn Battuta's travelogue offered a rare window into the medieval world. His observations on the social and economic landscapes of far-flung regions were invaluable to historians. He documented bustling bazaars where spices were worth their weight in gold, courts where diplomacy was a delicate dance, and societies where traditions were as diverse as the landscapes. Through his eyes, we glimpse a world interconnected by trade routes and cultural exchanges long before globalization became a buzzword. Now, here's where things get interesting. Ibn Battuta's accounts weren't just about the places he visited. They were a reflection of his own worldview, a blend of curiosity, cultural pride, and a touch of ethnocentrism. He often viewed the world through the lens of his Islamic upbringing, which shaped his interpretations and interactions. In India, he was both a judge and a guest, caught between the familiar and the foreign. In Africa, he marveled at the gold yet grappled with the grim realities of the slave trade. But let's not romanticize his legacy without acknowledging the gritty realities he often glossed over. Ibn Battuta's travels reveal the economic and political dynamics of his time, where trade was a lifeline and power was as fluid as the sands he crossed. His narratives highlight the harsh truths of medieval travel. Disease, distance, and danger were constant companions. Yet he navigated these challenges with a resilience that speaks to the indomitable human spirit. What can modern travelers learn from Ibn Battuta's epic journey? For starters, adaptability is key. Whether you're navigating the labyrinthine streets of Marrakech or the digital corridors of an airport, flexibility is your best ally. Ibn Battuta's success lay in his ability to embrace the unexpected, whether it was a detour through Alexandria or a court appointment in Delhi. His story reminds us that the journey is often more enlightening than the destination. Finally, let's talk legacy. Ibn Battuta's travels may have ended, but his stories continue to inspire. He left behind a chronicle of human experience that transcends time and geography. His journey was a testament to the power of storytelling, a reminder that even in an age without Instagram, tales of adventure can captivate and connect us. The Rihla stands as a monument to curiosity and courage, urging us to explore beyond our horizons and embrace the unknown. So, as we close the chapter on Ibn Battuta's adventures, let's carry forward his spirit of exploration. Whether you're venturing into the wilds of the internet or the wilderness of a new country, remember, the world is vast, stories are endless, and the journey is what you make it. And who knows? Maybe one day, centuries from now, someone will recount your adventures with the same awe and wonder as we do Ibn Battuta's. Until then, keep wandering, keep wondering, and keep weaving your own tales. If Southeast Asia were a board game in the 7th century, Srivijaya would be the player who snagged Park Place and Boardwalk with hotels on both. Located smack dab in the middle of what's now Indonesia, the Srivijaya Empire didn't just sit pretty. It commanded the Straits of Malacca like a medieval toll booth on steroids. This wasn't just any stretch of water. Oh no, it was the aquatic version of the Silk Road, where spices, gold, and exotic goods floated by like a never-ending parade of riches. Whoever controlled this strait essentially had a chokehold on the arteries of international trade, and Srivijaya held that position with the tenacity of a caffeinated octopus. Now, before you start thinking of Srivijaya as some idyllic paradise with friendly merchants and peaceful exchanges, let's set the record straight. The empire's rise wasn't just a happy accident. It was the result of some cunning political maneuvering and ruthless maritime strategies. Imagine a geopolitical chess match where the pieces are boats filled with silk and spices, and the stakes are as high as a skyscraper in Singapore. Speaking of Singapore, think of Srivijaya as its ancient counterpart, a bustling hub that didn't have the Marina Bay sands but was just as crucial to trade. The empire stretched its tentacles across Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, and even parts of Java and Borneo. At its peak, It was like the Walmart of the maritime world, offering everything from textiles to precious metals, all while ensuring that every passing ship paid its dues. Talk about an ancient form of taxation without representation. So how did this empire pull off such a feat? The answer lies in its strategic location and the savvy of its rulers. The Malacca Strait was the maritime equivalent of a highway rest stop, only way more lucrative. Ships sailing between India and China had to pass through, making Srivijaya the middleman of choice, or rather, the only option if you didn't want your goods to end up in Davy Jones' larker. The empire's location was like having a monopoly on the world's most profitable trade route. The socio-political landscape of the time was no less fascinating. The 7th century was an era of shifting alliances and rapidly changing power dynamics. In this Game of Thrones, Srivijaya's rulers were as much diplomats as they were warriors. They forged alliances with local chieftains and neighboring kingdoms, consolidating their power not just through brute force, but also through marriage alliances and religious patronage. Picture a medieval version of LinkedIn connections, only with more gold and fewer annoying notifications. Srivijaya's rulers were also quite the religious entrepreneurs. They were staunch supporters of Buddhism, using it as a tool to legitimize their rule and extend their influence. By sponsoring Buddhist monasteries and scholars, they attracted pilgrims and intellectuals from across Asia, turning their kingdom into a spiritual as well as a commercial hub. It was like combining Wall Street with a dash of the Vatican, all in one empire. But let's not romanticize it too much. While the empire's leaders were busy playing the long game, the average Joe, or let's say the average Joko, probably had a different perspective. For them, life under Srivijaya's rule might have been more about grinding labor than grand strategy. The empire's wealth was built on the backs of farmers, sailors, and craftsmen who worked tirelessly to keep the wheels, or rather, the ships, turning. It's easy to forget that beneath the glimmer of gold and the allure of spices, there were calloused hands and weary eyes. So, as the Srivijaya Empire rose to power, it was both a marvel and a machine, a blend of brilliance and brutality. It was a testament to the strategic genius of its rulers and the resilience of its people. As we delve deeper into the story of this maritime powerhouse, remember that the waters of the Malacca Strait were as treacherous as they were lucrative. Srivijaya's saga is one of ambition, commerce, and the relentless pursuit of dominance in a world where the sea was the ultimate frontier. Speaking of the Malacca Strait's lucrative treachery, let's take a closer look at the economic engine that propelled the Srivijaya Empire into the stratosphere of ancient power. Imagine spices, gold, and silk not as mere luxuries, but as the Bitcoin of their day. These were commodities that didn't just spice up a dish or add bling to one's wardrobe. They were the very currency of empires. The stuff wars were fought over, and peace treaties were inked upon. Srivijaya's rulers weren't just sitting around waiting for their ships to come in. Oh no, they were the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs of their time, flipping the script on trade by transforming their empire into a giant tax haven with a twist. The twist being that they were the ones collecting the tolls. Every ship that dared to pass through the Malacca Strait had to cough up a tariff. Think of it as a medieval version of those convenience fees you pay when buying concert tickets online. Only this fee was enforced by a fleet of warships that could make your cargo disappear faster than a magician's assistant. You see, Srivijaya's taxation system was less about bureaucracy and more about muscle. Imagine the empire's navy as a floating IRS, only with fewer audits and more boarding parties. Ships carrying goods between India and China were essentially cash cows, and the Srivijaya Empire milked them for all they were worth. The empire's coffers swelled, allowing them to maintain a formidable naval presence, which in turn ensured their continued dominance over the trade route. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth and power that would make even the shrewdest hedge fund manager blush. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of this seafaring economy. The reality was far from the idyllic image of bustling markets and friendly exchanges. The empire's wealth rested on a precarious balance of power, and any misstep could lead to disaster. One wrong move, one failed alliance, and the whole house of cards could come tumbling down. The rulers of Srivijaya knew this all too well, which is why they played their cards close to the chest, fostering relationships with powerful neighbors and keeping a watchful eye on any potential rivals. And while we're on the subject of rivals, it's worth noting that Srivijaya wasn't the only player in the game. Other maritime powers were eager to get a piece of the action, and the empire had to constantly fend off challenges to its supremacy. The seas were a battleground, and Srivijaya's rulers were as much warriors as they were businessmen. They had to be, for the stakes were nothing less than control over the lifeblood of the ancient economy. In this high-stakes game, the empire's rulers were adept at walking the tightrope between diplomacy and intimidation. They knew when to extend the olive branch and when to brandish the sword, a skill that kept their empire afloat in the turbulent waters of geopolitics. It was a delicate dance, one that required as much finesse as it did brute force. Yet, amidst the drama of naval battles and political intrigue, there was a certain beauty to the economic machine of Srivijaya. The empire was a melting pot of cultures and ideas, a place where East met West in a vibrant tapestry of trade and commerce. It was a hub where merchants from distant lands converged, exchanging not just goods, but knowledge and innovation. The Srivijaya Empire was the ancient world's answer to a global marketplace, a testament to the power of trade in shaping the course of history. But let's not forget the unsung heroes of this economic engine, the sailors, the craftsmen, the farmers who toiled behind the scenes to keep the empire running. Their labor was the foundation upon which the empire's wealth was built, a reminder that beneath the glitz and glamour of trade lay the gritty reality of hard work and sacrifice. For every ship that sailed through the Malacca Strait, there were countless hands that had labored to produce its cargo, a testament to the interconnectedness of the ancient world. As we continue our journey through the rise of the Srivijaya Empire, let's keep in mind that this was a story not just of power and prosperity, but of people and their aspirations. The empire was a living, breathing entity, shaped by the dreams and ambitions of those who called it home. It was a world of contrasts, where the extraordinary and the everyday coexisted in a delicate balance. And as we delve deeper into the story of Srivijaya, we'll see that the waters of the Malacca Strait, much like those who navigated them, were anything but predictable. As we meander deeper into the tangled web of Srivijaya's political prowess, picture an empire that ran its governance with the precision of a Swiss watch, only one that occasionally resembled a medieval version of corporate boardroom politics, complete with power plays and strategic takeovers. In the Srivijaya Empire, rulers didn't just govern. They orchestrated a symphony of politics, military might, and religious influence that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. Let's start with the political structure, which wasn't your run-of-the-mill monarchy. The Srivijayan rulers, known as Maharajas, wielded power like modern-day CEOs, balancing benevolence and ruthlessness as needed. They were the ultimate multitaskers, managing alliances with local chieftains while keeping an eye on any competitors ready to pounce. The empire was divided into mandalas, a system of loosely affiliated regions that operated with a mix of autonomy and allegiance to the central authority. Think of it as a franchise model where each local ruler had a stake, but the head honcho in Palembang held the ultimate veto power. Now, about that military might. Srivijaya wasn't just about collecting tolls, it was about enforcing them. The empire boasted a navy that was less about pomp and more about packing a punch. Their fleet was the ancient equivalent of a naval strike force, complete with agile ships known as junks that could outmaneuver larger vessels. These ships were the backbone of Srivijaya's power, enabling them to control the Malacca Strait with a grip tighter than attacks ordered her on April 14th. Their military strategy was all about calculated aggression. They knew when to flex their muscles and when to negotiate peace, a balancing act that kept potential invaders at bay and trade flowing smoothly. Then there's the religious influence, which was as much a political tool as it was a spiritual guide. Srivijaya was a bastion of Mahayana Buddhism, and the rulers knew how to leverage this religious devotion to their advantage. By patronizing Buddhist institutions, they not only legitimized their rule, but also turned their empire into a spiritual sanctuary. This was the ancient world's version of a brand partnership, where religious patronage was the influencer marketing of the day. Pilgrims from as far as China and India flocked to Srivijaya, bringing with them not just religious fervor, but also economic opportunities. It was a win-win situation. The empire got spiritual prestige, and the pilgrims got their enlightenment with a side of exotic spices. But let's not sugarcoat it. These rulers were no saints. They could be as ruthless as a cutthroat Wall Street banker when the situation demanded. Diplomatic relations often involved a bit of arm-twisting, and their business takeovers were sometimes more hostile than friendly. They had a knack for turning rivals into subsidiaries, expanding their influence through a combination of military prowess and shrewd diplomacy. Picture a hostile corporate takeover, only with more swords and fewer spreadsheets. In the grand tapestry of history, Srivijaya's leaders are often painted as benevolent philosopher kings. But don't let the serene statues fool you. Behind the serene smiles were minds that calculated every move, balancing power and piety with the finesse of a chess grandmaster. They were the original disruptors, constantly innovating their strategies to maintain dominance over the maritime trade routes. Yet, while the Maharajas played their high-stakes game, the average Srivijayan was probably less concerned with geopolitics and more with day-to-day survival. For the common folks, life wasn't a golden chariot ride. It was more like a rickety cart journey over rocky terrain. The empire's glittering facade was built on the labor of countless individuals who worked tirelessly to keep the wheels of commerce turning. As we unravel the complexities of Srivijaya's political landscape, it's clear that this was an empire of contrasts. Its rulers were both revered and feared, masters of a realm where power was as fluid as the waters they controlled. In examining their story, we see a reflection of human nature itself, a blend of ambition and pragmatism, where the pursuit of power often walked hand in hand with the quest for meaning. As we delve further into the saga of Srivijaya, remember that in this empire, as in life, the currents of power were ever shifting, and only those who could navigate the tides survived. As the Srivijaya Empire navigated the turbulent waters of geopolitics and trade, it wasn't just about power and profit. It was also about piety and prestige. Think of it as the ancient version of a Silicon Valley tech hub, but instead of coding startups, it was buzzing with Buddhist scholars and spiritual seekers. Picture an empire that managed to turn religious devotion into a booming business model, with temples and monasteries sprouting up faster than coffee shops in a hipster neighborhood. In the grand scheme of Buddhist centers, Srivijaya was like the cool older sibling to the other religious hotspots, a place where the spiritual and material worlds collided in spectacular fashion. By the 8th century, it was already a magnet for Buddhist monks, scholars, and pilgrims from as far away as Nalanda in India and the Tang dynasty in China. And why wouldn't it be? The empire was like a celestial conference center, offering enlightenment with a view of the Malacca Strait. Srivijaya's cultural clout wasn't just about spiritual tourism, though. It also played a pivotal role in the exchange of ideas, philosophies, and art forms. Think of it as the original TED talk stage, minus the laser pointers and PowerPoint presentations. The empire was a melting pot where Indian, Chinese, and indigenous Southeast Asian cultures blended seamlessly. This cultural cross-pollination wasn't just a happy accident. It was a deliberate strategy by Srivijaya's rulers to bolster their prestige and influence. Now, let's talk architecture. Srivijaya's temples and monasteries weren't just spiritual sanctuaries. They were marvels of engineering and design. Take the Muaro Jambai temple complex, for instance. This site, sprawling over 12 square kilometers along the banks of the Batanghari River, was a testament to the empire's architectural prowess. These temples weren't just places of worship, but also served as educational and cultural hubs, akin to medieval universities. It was like Hogwarts, but with more meditation. When it came to literary achievements, Srivijaya was no slouch either. The empire was a bustling center of Buddhist scholarship, producing texts that traveled far beyond its borders. Picture a monastic scriptorium that could give any modern publishing house a run for its money. These texts weren't just religious treatises, but also covered philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. The spread of these works was like a pre-internet version of viral content, disseminating knowledge across Asia without a single meme in sight. And while we're on the subject of cultural diffusion, let's debunk a few myths. The romantic notion of ideas flowing freely like a gentle river is as misleading as a politician's campaign promises. The reality was more like a game of high-stakes poker, where cultural exchanges were often accompanied by political maneuvering and economic incentives. Srivijaya's rulers were adept at playing this game, using cultural diplomacy to strengthen their empire. They knew that a well-placed scholar or monk could wield as much influence as a fleet of warships. In terms of religious significance, Srivijaya was a powerhouse of Mahayana Buddhism, a fact that wasn't lost on the Tang dynasty. The Chinese rulers were keenly aware of Srivijaya's spiritual cachet and sent envoys to establish diplomatic ties. This was a savvy move, as it allowed both empires to benefit from trade and cultural exchanges. It was like a cross-continental collaboration, where both parties got to share the spotlight and the spoils. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't some idyllic utopia where everyone sang Kumbaya. Beneath the surface of cultural harmony lay a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and power struggles. The empire's rulers were constantly balancing the demands of religious patronage with the harsh realities of political governance. It was like walking a tightrope over a pit of crocodiles, where one misstep could lead to disaster. Despite these challenges, Srivijaya managed to maintain its status as a cultural and religious beacon for centuries. Its legacy is still felt today, not just in the remnants of its temples and texts, but in the rich tapestry of Southeast Asian culture. The empire's story is a reminder that in the world of ideas, as in the world of trade, the tides are ever changing, and those who can navigate them are the ones who leave a lasting mark. In the end, the Srivijaya Empire was more than just a maritime powerhouse. It was a cultural crossroads that shaped the course of history in ways that still resonate today. Its rulers were not just conquerors and traders, but also patrons and philosophers, weaving a legacy that transcended the boundaries of time and space. As we continue exploring the story of Srivijaya, we'll see that its impact was as profound as the oceans it once ruled, a testament to the enduring power of culture and commerce in shaping the human experience. And as we sail further into this narrative, remember, in the grand tapestry of history, Srivijaya's threads are woven with both ambition and enlightenment, a blend that continues to captivate the imagination. And so, the story of the Srivijaya Empire, an empire that once juggled cultural prestige and economic dominance like a circus performer with a penchant for high stakes, begins its final chapter. The decline, as always, was not a dramatic plunge, but a slow unraveling. Picture a grand tapestry coming undone, thread by thread, as forces both external and internal gnawed away at the empire's fabric. Let's start with the economic factors that cracked the empire's golden facade. By the 11th century, Srivijaya's maritime monopoly had become more of a pipe dream than a reality. Regional competitors, like the Chola dynasty from southern India, were not just standing idly by. No, these guys were sharpening their swords and eyeing Srivijaya's juicy trade routes like a cat eyeing a particularly plump mouse. The Cholas launched a series of devastating raids between 1025 and 1027, hitting Srivijaya's heartland in Palembang and other key ports with the force of a rogue tidal wave. The result? A significant dent in Srivijaya's naval prowess and a big hole in its pocketbook. Meanwhile, other maritime powers in the region, like the Javanese kingdoms, were also getting in on the action. They began to bypass the Malacca Strait, opting for alternative routes that left Srivijaya's tall booths as desolate as a ghost town at high noon. It was like watching your favorite band's exclusive gig get upstaged by a surprise concert from a pop sensation, devastating and hard to compete with. Politically, the Srivijaya rulers were facing a crisis of confidence, or perhaps complacency. Call it the "we've got this" syndrome that so often precedes a fall. Internal strife was simmering, and the once loyal Mandalas began eyeing independence like rebellious teenagers eager to leave the nest. The empire that had once been a cohesive conglomerate of regions started splintering like a fragile vase, meeting a hard floor. And let's not forget the religious and cultural shifts. Islam was making its entrance on the Southeast Asian stage, spreading through trade routes and slowly but surely influencing the socio-political landscape. The once dominant Buddhist influence of Srivijaya started to wane, as local rulers found new religious affiliations that promised not just spiritual salvation, but also political alliances. By the 13th century, the empire was a shadow of its former self, and the rise of the Majapahit Empire in Java was the final nail in the coffin. Srivijaya's decline wasn't just about losing control over trade routes, it was about losing the narrative. The empire that had once dictated terms was now a historical footnote, a case study in how not to rest on your laurels while the world changes around you. But before you start shedding tears for Srivijaya, let's talk legacy. In the grand tapestry of history, the threads of Srivijaya still weave their way through modern Southeast Asia. Its cultural and religious influences linger, like echoes of a once mighty empire that refused to be silenced. The architectural wonders like the Muaro Jambai temples stand as testament to an era where art and spirituality were as intertwined as vine and tree. Economically, Srivijaya's model of maritime trade and tolls set the stage for future Southeast Asian powers. The Malacca Strait remains a crucial artery of international commerce, a nod to the empire that once held it in an iron grip. The multicultural exchanges that Srivijaya fostered paved the way for the region's rich tapestry of languages, religions, and customs, a blend as vibrant as the spices that once filled its ships. As for the question of whether history repeats itself or just loves a good sequel, well, that's the million-dollar query, isn't it? Empires rise and fall with the predictability of a soap opera plot twist, yet each iteration adds a new layer to the human experience. Maybe history doesn't repeat so much as it remixes, taking familiar themes and giving them a fresh spin. Like a DJ at a club, mixing the old with the new, ensuring the dance floor of history is never empty. So as we wrap up our journey through the rise and fall of the Srivijaya Empire, let's remember that history isn't just a series of dates and events. It's a reflection of human nature, with all its ambition, folly, and brilliance. And while the empire itself may have slipped beneath the waves of time, its legacy continues to ripple across the waters of Southeast Asia. Who knows? Perhaps, in some distant future, a new empire will rise, inspired by Srivijaya's tale, one that understands the delicate dance between power and humility, between holding on and letting go. Until then, the story of Srivijaya serves as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of what once was, reminding us that history is less about what happened and more about what we choose to remember. In the vast and dusty steppe of 13th-century Mongolia, where the smell of fermented mare's milk was as common as the endless horizons, a young boy named Kublai was coming of age under the daunting shadow of his grandfather, Genghis Khan. If you think living up to a family legacy is hard, try being the grandson of a man whose idea of a family outing was the conquest of half the known world. Genghis Khan was the kind of overachiever who made everyone else seem like they were slacking off, even when they were actually busy trying to survive his empire's relentless march. Kublai was born in 1215, a year when the Mongol Empire was flexing its muscles across Eurasia and sending shivers down the spines of kings and commoners alike. From a young age, Kublai was steeped in stories of his grandfather's exploits, tales that were equal parts inspiring and terrifying. Genghis wasn't just a warrior, he was the CEO of Conquest Inc. Expanding his empire like it was a medieval version of monopoly, complete with real estate in the form of entire countries. But Kublai's childhood wasn't all about war stories and empire building. Growing up in the Mongol heartland, he was surrounded by a family that was as dynamic as it was dysfunctional. The Mongol princes were like a medieval version of a rock band, each with their own ambitions, rivalries, and occasional backstage brawls. Family dinners must have been interesting, the kind where you keep one hand on your yak milk and the other on your sword. The political chess game among the Mongol princes was a spectacle worthy of a soap opera. Marriages were arranged not with love in mind, but with an eye on political alliances, and betrayals were as common as the icy winds of the steppes. Kublai, however, had a knack for navigating these treacherous waters. Unlike some of his more hot-headed relatives, he had a cool, strategic mind. It was like he had an internal compass that always pointed him toward the path of least resistance, or at least the path that led to the least amount of bloodshed. A key piece in Kublai's unexpected rise to power was his fascination with Chinese culture. While his relatives were busy galloping across the plains, Kublai was turning his gaze elsewhere, absorbing the sophisticated and ancient traditions of China. At first, this seemed like a quirky distraction, akin to a rock star suddenly getting into knitting. But Kublai's interest was far from a hobby. It was a strategic vision that set him apart. He saw China not just as a land to be conquered, but as a civilization to be embraced and learned from. His love for Chinese culture was not universally appreciated among his nomadic kin. To them, Kublai probably seemed like the cousin who went off to art school and came back talking about existentialism and tofu. But Kublai understood something crucial. The future of the Mongol Empire lay not just in the strength of its cavalry, but in the rich cultural and administrative knowledge that could be drawn from China. As he grew older, Kublai began to play an increasingly significant role in the Mongol Empire's politics. He wasn't just a pawn in the family chess game. He was emerging as a player with his own strategies and moves. By the time he was in his 30s, he was already demonstrating a knack for leadership that combined the best of Mongol military prowess with the sophisticated statecraft of the Chinese. This unique blend of cultures would eventually become Kublai's trademark, and it was this vision that would propel him to the top of the Mongolian power pyramid. Kublai's path to power was anything but straightforward. It was filled with twists, turns, and more than a few backstabbing relatives, but his ability to adapt and learn set him apart. He wasn't just riding the wave of his grandfather's legacy. He was carving out his own place in history, one that would transform the Mongol Empire in ways that even Genghis might not have imagined. And so, from the windswept steppes to the imperial palaces of China, Kublai Khan began to make his mark, a testament to the power of vision and adaptability in a world where the only constant was change. As Kublai Khan stood on the precipice of history, he wasn't just contemplating the next step in a grand empire's saga. He was about to pull off a cultural fusion that would make any modern-day multicultural festival look like a neighborhood potluck. Kublai's ambitious expansion wasn't just about adding more land to his portfolio. It was about creating a legacy that would rival even the great Genghis Khans. But while Genghis was all about thunderous cavalry charges and the art of war, Kublai had a different kind of vision, one that involved cities, scholars, and yes, paper money. Let's talk about this paper currency for a moment. Imagine living in the 13th century, a time when coins were all the rage, and paper was what you used to jot down grocery lists, or, royal decrees. Now, Kublai comes along and decides paper could be money. It sounds like something a tech startup would pitch at a Silicon Valley conference today. But Kublai wasn't just making an economic statement. He was laying the foundation for a financial revolution. By 1260, Kublai had issued paper notes known as Ko, which were backed by the state and accepted across his empire. This move was as innovative as it was pragmatic. Carrying bags of coins was so last century, and Kublai was nothing if not forward-thinking. While the idea of paper money wasn't entirely new, China had dabbled in it before. It was Kublai who made it work on an imperial scale. This wasn't just about convenience, it was about control. By centralizing currency, Kublai could better manage the empire's economy, which, let's face it, was as sprawling and complex as a modern-day multinational corporation. The economic context here is key. Kublai's empire stretched from the Korean peninsula to Eastern Europe, and a standardized currency facilitated trade across these vast lands. It was a move that would make economists and historians alike nod in appreciation, even if it did cause a few headaches among local treasurers. Kublai's vision wasn't limited to financial innovation. No, he had architectural ambitions too, and they took the form of Khanbalik, later known as Beijing. Kublai wasn't content with tents on the steppe. He wanted a capital that embodied the grandeur of his empire. And so, in 1267, the construction of Khanbalik began, a city designed to awe and intimidate. Picture this: wide, straight avenues lined with palatial buildings, a layout that would make even the most meticulous urban planner swoon. It was a statement in stone, a declaration that the Mongol Empire was here to stay. Khanbalik wasn't just about scale, it was about sophistication. The city's design incorporated traditional Chinese principles of harmony and balance, reflecting Kublai's respect for the culture he had come to admire. It was a place where Mongol and Chinese influences merged, creating something new and extraordinary. This city was not just a political center, but a cultural melting pot where scholars, artists, and traders from across the empire could mingle and exchange ideas. The grand design of Khanbalik was a testament to Kublai's ability to blend the best of both worlds, making him a unique figure in a history often dominated by conquerors who preferred the sword to the pen. Yet, ruling such a vast territory came with its own set of bureaucratic nightmares. Imagine trying to coordinate a team meeting when your empire spans 12 time zones and your generals prefer horseback to email. The challenges were real, and Kublai had to rely on an intricate web of administrators, diplomats, and advisors to keep things running smoothly. This was no small feat, given the diverse cultures and languages within the empire. Kublai had to balance the interests of nomadic Mongols with those of settled Chinese populations, a task akin to juggling flaming swords while riding a unicycle. One of the more fascinating aspects of Kublai's reign was his ability to adapt and innovate. He understood that the nomadic way of life wasn't entirely compatible with governing an empire as vast as his, so he borrowed heavily from Chinese bureaucratic practices. This included the civil service exams, which Kublai used to create a merit-based system for selecting officials. It was a move that both streamlined governance and helped integrate Chinese administrators into the Mongol power structure. Kublai was a master of pragmatism, blending the administrative efficiency of Chinese governance with the military prowess of the Mongols. But let's not romanticize too much. Despite his innovations, Kublai's rule was far from idyllic. The sheer size of the empire meant that rebellions were as frequent as Mongol horse races. Kublai had to be constantly vigilant, quelling uprisings and ensuring loyalty among his ranks. The cost of maintaining such a sprawling empire was immense, both financially and in terms of human resources. Kublai's reign was marked by a constant struggle to balance expansion with consolidation, a challenge that would eventually strain even his formidable capabilities. As we delve further into Kublai's achievements, it's important to remember that his story is one of contrasts. He was a conqueror and a builder, a visionary and a pragmatist. His legacy is woven into the fabric of history, a testament to the power of adaptability and innovation in a world where the only constant was change. And while his empire would eventually fragment, Kublai's impact on history is undeniable. From the windswept steppes to the bustling streets of Khanbalik, his mark is indelible, reminder that even in the most tumultuous times, vision and leadership can create something truly remarkable. As we dive into the stormy seas of Kublai Khan's military ventures, it's crucial to remember that this wasn't just a man with a vision. It was a man with a plan, albeit one that sometimes went hilariously awry. Think of Kublai as the ultimate gambler, placing bets not at a poker table, but on entire nations. His attempts to invade Japan are the stuff of legend, but as we'll see, legend is often just a nicer word for catastrophe. Now, Kublai was no stranger to success. By 1271, he had declared himself Emperor of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. His empire was a behemoth that made the Roman Empire look like a quaint weekend project. But Kublai, never one to rest on his laurels, decided that Japan was next on his checklist. Why? Because when you're the head of the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen, why not add a few islands to the mix? The first invasion attempt happened in 1274. Kublai sent a fleet of 900 ships carrying 40,000 men, a cocktail of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers. Now, coordinating this kind of operation was no ordinary feat. If organizing a family vacation is stressful, imagine trying to synchronize an outright invasion with soldiers who didn't even speak the same language. It was like trying to direct an international choir where everyone's singing a different song. But the real kicker came from Mother Nature herself. As Kublai's forces approached Japan, they were met not by a welcoming committee, but by a typhoon. This wasn't just any storm. It was a meteorological middle finger known as a kamikaze, or divine wind. The term was later romanticized, but at the time, there was nothing divine about seeing your fleet dashed to bits. The Mongols were forced to limp home, having learned a harsh, soggy lesson. Undeterred, Kublai tried again in 1281. This time, he upped the ante with a force of 400 vessels and 140,000 men. Think of it as the medieval version of go big or go home. The logistical challenge was immense, akin to trying to throw a concert tour across countries that didn't even have roads. The fleet was divided into two parts, one launching from Korea and the other from southern China. Coordination was key, and spoiler alert, it didn't go well. Once again, the kamikaze struck. The typhoon shredded Kublai's grand armada like a paperboat in a bathtub. Thousands of soldiers were lost, and those who survived were met with fierce Japanese resistance. This second attempt was even more disastrous than the first, a blunder so grand it makes you wonder if Kublai had accidentally angered some weather guards along the way. The economic cost of these failed invasions was astronomical. The Mongol treasury, which at one time seemed endless, was now feeling the pinch. Funding such massive military expeditions wasn't like swiping a card at a self-checkout. It involved resources, manpower, and logistics that strained even Kublai's vast empire. This wasn't just about losing battles. It was about losing face, currency, and credibility. But why did Kublai keep trying? Well, he was driven by the age-old combo of ambition and hubris, a blend that's been responsible for more historical blunders than anything else. Japan was a prize in his eyes, and Kublai wasn't one to back down easily. Yet these failures taught him, and the world, a crucial lesson. Sometimes the universe has its own plans, and no amount of military might can change that. The aftermath of these failed invasions rippled through Kublai's empire. He had to contend with internal dissent and the brewing discontent of his subjects. The Mongols were traditionally land-based warriors, and the sea was an unfamiliar and unforgiving arena. Kublai had pushed them into uncharted waters, literally and metaphorically, and the consequences were as chaotic as a Mongol cavalry charge gone wrong. And yet, amid these debacles, Kublai's story remained one of remarkable resilience. His ability to bounce back from failure was as legendary as his ability to conquer. While the invasions of Japan were a blight on his otherwise illustrious military record, they didn't define him. Instead, they highlighted the limits of ambition and the unpredictable nature of power. Kublai Khan, the emperor who could blend cultures but not weather patterns, continued to rule with an iron, if somewhat damp, fist. His legacy, a complex tapestry woven from triumphs and failures, reminds us that even the most powerful figures in history were at the mercy of forces beyond their control. It's a lesson that resonates today, as we grapple with the realization that not every battle can be won, and not every dream can be realized. But it's the trying, the striving, and the audacity to dream that make history worth telling. Kublai Khan's knack for bouncing back from setbacks is almost as legendary as the blunders he occasionally orchestrated. But let's shift our gaze from the tempest-tossed seas to the more serene, yet equally complex world of cultural patronage and political maneuvering, where Kublai left an indelible mark. Here's a guy who could wield a sword and a brush with equal flair, making him the Renaissance man before the Renaissance even had its day in the sun. First up, the arts. Kublai Khan was the kind of patron who'd make any artist do a double take, a Mongol conqueror who appreciated the finer things in life. He didn't just want a kingdom that ran like a well-oiled war machine. He wanted his empire to hum with the chords of poetry, the strokes of calligraphy, and the whispers of ink on paper. Under his reign, the arts flourished like wildflowers after a spring rain. He invited scholars, artists, and artisans from all over the empire to his court, creating a cultural melting pot that would have given any modern diversity advocate a standing ovation. Kublai's court was a veritable United Nations of creativity, where Persian miniaturists mingled with Chinese painters, and poets from the Silk Road swapped verses with Mongol bards. It was a cultural exchange program that would have made the heads of universities today envious. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about soft power. Kublai understood that culture could be as persuasive as cavalry charges, sometimes even more so. And then there's the matter of Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant whose tales of Kublai's court have tantalized Western imaginations for centuries. According to Polo, Kublai's palace was a marvel of opulence, with roofs gilded in gold and walls clad in silver. The reality? Well, it's a bit more nuanced. Yes, Kublai's court was grand, but Marco's accounts may have stretched the truth like a fisherman boasting about his catch. In fairness to Polo, he was just doing what any good travel blogger does, spinning tales to captivate an audience hungry for the exotic. While Marco Polo's depictions contributed to the myth of Kublai's court as a place of unimaginable luxury, the reality was a bit less glitzy. Sure, there were lavish banquets and impressive ceremonies, but Kublai's court was also a bustling center of administration and governance. It was a place where scholars debated policy, advisors plotted strategies, and Kublai himself juggled the complexities of an empire as vast as it was diverse. The real magic of Kublai's court wasn't just in its grandeur, but in its function as a crucible of ideas and innovation. Now, let's talk governance. Managing an empire that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the edges of Eastern Europe was like trying to conduct an orchestra where each section played in a different key. Kublai had to balance Mongolian traditions with Chinese customs, a task akin to orchestrating a mashup between a punk band and a classical symphony. Under his rule, the Mongol Empire saw a fusion of administrative practices that borrowed from the best of both worlds. Take the civil service exams, for instance. Kublai adopted these from the Chinese model, establishing a merit-based system that ensured competent bureaucrats ran the show. This was a significant shift from the traditional Mongol approach, which often involved appointing officials based on lineage or military prowess. It was a pragmatic move that helped integrate Chinese expertise into the Mongol administration, streamlining governance and ensuring the empire didn't collapse under its own weight. But Kublai wasn't just a bureaucrat with a penchant for paperwork. He was a leader who understood the power of symbolism. In 1271, he declared the establishment of the Yuan dynasty, a name that evoked the concept of universal origin and was meant to legitimize Mongol rule in China. It was a strategic rebranding, a way to signal both continuity with the past and a new chapter under Mongol leadership. And it worked, for a while at least, allowing Kublai to consolidate his power and project an image of stability and authority. However, Kublai's reign wasn't without its challenges. The sheer scale of the empire meant that keeping the peace was as difficult as maintaining a house of cards in a windstorm. Rebellions flared up with alarming regularity, and the cost of quelling these uprisings, both in terms of resources and human lives, was immense. Kublai's ability to maintain control was a testament to his leadership, but it also underscored the fragility of his empire's unity. And then, there's the economy. We've already touched on Kublai's innovative use of paper money, but let's dig a little deeper. The introduction of the KO wasn't just a financial convenience, it was a tool for centralizing economic control. By issuing paper currency, Kublai could regulate trade across his vast territories, facilitating commerce from east to west. It was a bold experiment, and for a time it worked. But like all experiments, it had its hiccups. Counterfeiting became an issue, and the value of the paper notes fluctuated like a medieval stock market, causing headaches for merchants and officials alike. Kublai's economic policies were ambitious, but they also reflected the inherent tensions within his empire. The Mongols were traditionally a nomadic people, and the transition to a sedentary, agrarian economy wasn't without its challenges. Kublai had to juggle these competing interests, balancing the needs of his nomadic kin with the demands of settled Chinese populations. It was a delicate dance, and one that required all of Kublai's political acumen to navigate. As we peel back the layers of Kublai's legacy, it's clear that his story is one of contrasts. He was a conqueror who embraced culture, a warrior who valued wisdom, and a ruler who understood that power was as much about perception as it was about force. His court was a place where East met West, where ideas flowed as freely as the Mongol cavalry once did across the steppes. Yet, beneath the surface of this vibrant tapestry lay the realities of governance, the pressures of maintaining an empire, and the constant threat of rebellion. So, as we explore Kublai Khan's cultural and political legacy, we find a man who was as complex as the empire he ruled. He was a patron of the arts, and a master of administration, a figure whose influence extended far beyond the borders of his domain. His story, a blend of myth and reality, continues to captivate and confound, reminding us that history is never as simple as it seems. And as we look ahead to the final chapters of Kublai's saga, we'll see how his legacy endured, and how it set the stage for the Mongol Empire's eventual decline. Stay tuned, because the story's far from over. As we look ahead to the final chapters of Kublai Khan's saga, we find ourselves at the crossroads of power and decline, where even the mightiest empire can start to resemble a once thriving party, now dwindling to a sleepy gathering. Kublai Khan, the man who once juggled cultures like a circus performer with too many flaming torches, faced the twilight of his years with fewer victories and more vexations. The Yuan dynasty, once the glittering jewel in his imperial crown, began to show cracks, not unlike a porcelain vase left too close to the edge of a crowded shelf. Let's begin with Kublai himself. By the time he reached his late 60s, ruling over an empire that stretched from the Korean peninsula to Hungary was an exercise in controlled chaos. The physical and mental toll was visible. Kublai was no longer the vigorous conqueror he once was. He was aging, and with age came ailments. Reports suggest he became obese, suffering from ailments like gout. He faced the relentless reality of being mortal in a world that demanded superhuman endurance. Running an empire was hard enough without your joints reminding you that you're not as spry as you used to be. Then there was the issue of succession, a problem as old as monarchy itself. Kublai's beloved wife, Chabai, had passed away in 1281, and his chosen heir, Zhenjin, died 4 years later. The loss of these key figures left Kublai grappling with grief and uncertainty about the future. He appointed his grandson Temur as his successor, but the internal dynamics of Mongol politics were as tangled as a horse's mane after a thunderstorm. The unity that Kublai had fought so hard to maintain began to fray at the edges, with rival factions eyeing the throne like sharks, circling a shipwreck. The empire itself was a patchwork quilt of diverse cultures, and keeping it stitched together was becoming increasingly difficult. The Mongols, with their nomadic roots, struggled to adapt fully to the sedentary, bureaucratic demands of Chinese governance. The Chinese, on the other hand, viewed the Mongols as uncultured interlopers. It was a cultural clash of epic proportions, like trying to blend rock and roll with classical opera. Kublai's attempts to balance these competing interests were like trying to hold water in a sieve no matter how hard he tried. Some of it always slipped through. Economically, the empire was feeling the pinch too. The vast expenditures on failed military campaigns, such as the infamous Japanese debacles, had drained the treasury. The introduction of paper money, while innovative, had its pitfalls. Inflation was a persistent problem, and counterfeiting was rampant. Think of it as the medieval version of identity theft. The economy was a complex beast that even Kublai's formidable intellect couldn't fully tame. Meanwhile, the provinces were growing restless. Rebellions and uprisings became more frequent, with local warlords and disgruntled officials testing the limits of Kublai's authority. In southern China, the remnants of the Song dynasty resisted Mongol rule, their loyalty as steadfast as bamboo bending in the wind but never breaking. In the north, the traditional Mongol heartland was becoming increasingly autonomous, slipping from Kublai's grasp like sand through fingers. The empire was fragmenting, with each piece vying for its own slice of the power pie. Kublai's legacy, however, was not just about the empire he built, but the cultural bridges he forged. His reign saw unprecedented interactions between East and West, thanks in part to the Silk Road and figures like Marco Polo. These exchanges left a lasting mark on global culture, planting the seeds for what would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. Kublai's court was a melting pot where knowledge and ideas flowed freely, enriching all who came into contact with them. Despite the challenges, Kublai's impact on Chinese history was profound. He established the Yuan dynasty, which, despite its later decline, was a period of significant cultural and economic development. He promoted Buddhism, ensuring it spread throughout China and beyond. His efforts to integrate Chinese administrative practices into Mongol governance laid the groundwork for future dynasties, even if they didn't always acknowledge their debt to him. Yet, by the time of Kublai's death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty was on the brink of collapse. The empire he had worked so hard to hold together was fracturing, not with a bang, but a whimper. The Mongol rulers who followed lacked Kublai's vision and adaptability, and the dynasty struggled to maintain its grip on power. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty was overthrown by the Ming, a new force rising from the south like a phoenix from the ashes, ready to write the next chapter in China's storied history. In the end, Kublai Khan's story is one of ambition and adaptability, marked by triumphs and failures, a complex tapestry woven with threads of conquest and culture. He was a man who dared to dream big, to embrace change, and to blend disparate worlds into a cohesive whole. His legacy is a reminder that even the greatest empires are built on the fragile foundations of human endeavor, subject to the whims of time and tide. Kublai Khan may have left this world, but his influence endures, whispering through the pages of history, a testament to the power of vision and the inexorable march of change.